Welcome, everyone. My name is Marina Otero, and I'm the director of HEDNEW Institute, the research department. Welcome to the Coming South. The Coming South is a three-part online event taking place from today until Saturday, and it explores the inequality from a geopolitical perspective to the local level. As growing inequalities are sustaining the global North and global South world order, we ask how to respond and how to overcome these deepening divides. This event is co-organized by HEDNEW Institute together with Angela Dimitrakaki from the University of Edinburgh. It consists on lectures, films, and discussions from contributors, including Athena Athanasiou, Marco Barbale, Tings Chak, Jaisa Hernandez Velázquez, Kevin Ochieng Okoth, Miguel Pérez dos Santos, Vijay Prasad, Rad, Jonas Stahl, Paulo Tavares, and François Verger. Why we are organizing this symposium? At a moment when Western epistemologies, Western forms of knowledge generally associated with the global North are proven insufficient to the struggles of the subaltern, leading instead to exploitative, extractive, and erasing practices, we ask, what actually counts as Western knowledge? And as Angela reminds, what does the term Western hide from view? Would reparation to these exploitative, extractive, and erasing practices come perhaps from the knowledges of the South? But what and who is the South today? How the imaginaries and stereotypes of the South are constructed? Is the South a territory, a conceptual framework, or a principle for action both locally and globally? Why at the New Institute and in Rotterdam, where we are located, this is relevant today, why we decided to have this symposium. The New Institute is located in Rotterdam, and Rotterdam is one of the most diverse European cities, where 52% of the population, and in some districts, almost 70% is of migrant origin. Within Rotterdam, the city's south has been a site of ongoing struggle. It has been subjected to neglect and precarization, criminalization, exoticization, gentrification, and ultimately displacement of its population. Institutions, investors, individuals are going south. The South is seen as the new frontier where to explore and colonize within the city. At the New Institute, we have been working with the RAD. The RAD is the Board of the South, a self-appointed political representative body of the South and its inhabitants. This board wants to make their voice heard and take place and part in the decision-making processes that affect them directly. They will run a workshop tomorrow, and our intent is that these days will serve as an inspiration and a catalyst for action here, and also elsewhere, in this South and in any other South. Discussions on inequality between North and South are generally framed through notions of solidarity. Angela and I come from the South, from Greece and from Spain, but we are also working in institutions in the North. So we are carriers of both South and North. For us, it was important to discuss also these notions through the European perspective. So we are going through the Rotterdam European, and obviously we will go through many other Souths and territories. But in recent months, during the coronavirus crisis, and within the framework of the economic recovery packages that had been negotiated in Europe, the contrast between the Northern and Southern Europe had once again played a major role. The Netherlands, through its Minister of Finance, positioned itself against money transfers to the South without strict conditions attached to it. His Portuguese colleague called his stance disgusting. And Italian dignitaries placed a full-page ad calling the Netherlands selfish and denouncing the lack of ethics and solidarity. In 2017, another Dutch politician, and at that moment president of the Eurogroup, said, solidarity entails obligations. I cannot spend all my money on wine and women and then ask for your support, he said, referring to the countries in the South. These instances were referred to and discussed in an article at the Groene Amsterdammer in July 2020, written by the chief editor Sandra Schutte. The South is seen, she says, as the cradle of European civilization. The journey to the South has been a formative undertaking since the Middle Ages. Painters and poets have sought freedom and inspiration in the Mediterranean countries for centuries and project on them everything that is not done in their cool homelands. The contrast between the North and the South not only plays a role in Europe when it comes to money, but it also in the relation to other further, she says, South, for instance, in the Africa continent. These questions were the reason why we decided to contact Angela and ask her to help us think through these ideas. And she has curated a magnificent lineup for this conversation. So I'm extremely grateful to Angela, and I'm gonna introduce her and leave the floor to her. Angela Dimitrakaki, Dr. Angela Dimitrakaki is a writer and senior lecturer in contemporary art history and theory at the University of Edinburgh. She is program director of the Masters in Modern and Contemporary Art, History, Curating, and Criticism. Angela's academic research focuses, among others, on feminist and Marxist methodologies in art, history, globalization and biopolitics, contemporary democracy, and fascism. Before I leave the room to Angela, I want to remind all of you that please share your questions in the post during the talks, so then we can have a look at them and bring them back to the speakers. So with no more delay, welcome, Angela.
Thank you, Marina. So, dear speakers, dear audience and participants, and dear New Institute, I am delighted, absolutely delighted we're finally here, technologically connected here across nation states and time zones to be informed and discuss. Our subject is the coming South, a bittersweet designation for this meeting, which is intended to address the North-South divide. The North-South divide is not an issue on which one can take a position. Rather, the divide does the job of positioning its subjects. The coming South, a formulation then in need of critical interpretation and a form brimming with content. Maybe even a real movement in history. No doubt some must have noted the symposium's title, oblique reference to Agamben's The Coming Community from 1990 and The Invisible Committers, The Coming Insurrection from a few years later. And in 2020, community and insurrection remain enacted, yet precarious. Our struggles, and let's note here this always suspect our struggles are carried out in the intensification of capital's effort for value creation. Whatever it takes, this is not where less is more applies. Rather, more is more, until all is depleted, extracted, valorized. The North-South divide is how this is done, and there is nothing uncomplicated about it. Equally complicated is how resistance to this norm takes place. I always wanted to ask this question: how are efforts to suppress revolutions in the geopolitical South connected with the suppression of revolutions in the geopolitical North and vice versa? And also at the moment when emancipatory epistemologies and the resistances in the plural that give rise to them coalesce on the decolonial, I think it's time to reflect. We're not yet in the era of post, as in post-colonial. Maybe we are past it and past the illusions of peaceful and equal coexistence that flourished. It's best to face up to the real conditions of the divide and do the durational, social, and intellectual work that decolonizing dictates. But what is the objective here? Is decolonizing meant to stop at some point, or very much like a woman's work. Decolonizing will never be done. If the decolonial does not entail the hope for a return to a better time, then that could be because a better time has not come yet. Insurrection is no resurrection, if I can put it this way. The Coming South, subtitled Epistemologies, Struggles, Epistemological Solidarity, seeks to respond to the deepening divides that sustain the polarization and hierarchies underpinning the global North, global South world order in our century, in the early 21st century. The outcome of permanent imperialism, which is a requirement for capital's reign, this world order is made manifest not just in global geopolitics, as Marina mentioned before, but also in the microenvironments of urban and rural spaces, defining therefore formal and informal relationships, not just among nation states, but also among local communities. But even if the issues are systemic, they tend to register always as specific and particular to this or that context, to this or that community, and so on. So moving beyond the experience of the specific and the particular requires constant effort in joining the dots and engaging a back and forth between the lived reality and the frameworks that shape our understanding of it. Questions are asked about the value of Western epistemologies to the struggles of the subaltern. But the question we want to pose, I guess, is what counts actually as Western epistemologies, and what is this adjective, what kind of relations it prevents us from seeing about the very formation of those epistemologies, and who contributed to making them, to bring them up. So what is the apparent and less apparent ideological and actual function of the border culture that is openly proposed as a containment of the South at the moment of neoliberalism's multiple crises? And of course, what and who is the South today? We can ask this before we ask where the South is. Is it one? Or is it a number of Souths that organize the hierarchy of the global division of labor and the struggles which are connected with it? And finally, of course, the question of solidarity, whether this is a mere declaration of intent or whether it can be sustained as a long-term sharing of transformative social objectives that resist the current state of affairs. So the 3 days of the conference were mapped on intersecting themes. Today, we're focusing on frameworks of theory and practice. Tomorrow, Friday, on de-exoticizations, tourists, refugees, capital. And on Saturday, we propose to think about revolutions, prospects in our very counter-revolutionary times. So perhaps you would disagree with that, and that would make me very happy that our times are not counter-revolutionary. Today's theme then was conceived as an exploration, an extremely selective one, mind you, of frameworks that sustain practice and theory and the material conditions that underpin them. The struggles of the South are also part of these material conditions, but they're also part of the history of ideas. And where do these meet? There are specific moments in the history of ideas mattered more than others in the struggles. What is the role of art? What can the move from theory to practice entail for the subjects involved? So I stop here with my introduction, and with many thanks for your attention. And I will introduce the first speaker, who is Tings Chak, is an artist, writer, and organizer whose work contributes to popular struggles across the South. Her current research focuses on the art of national liberation struggles. Tings received her Master of Architecture from the University of Toronto and is the author and illustrator of Undocumented: The Architecture of Migrant Detention. She also leads the art department of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. And tonight, we're very happy to have her with us, and she will speak about art against imperialism, yesterday and today. And things you take on from this point.
Thank you very much, Angela and Marina, and all the organizers of the Coming South and the New Institute for convening this amazing gathering. Really honored to be here and representing Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. And of course, Vijay Prashad, our director, will be speaking on the third day and in the closing panel, so you'll be hearing more about our work there. Today, I'll be sharing more about the cultural work that we've been doing, the historical research, and also the contemporary work we've been doing, building an international network of artists and designers that are aligned with people's struggles and people's movements around the world. So without sharing too much more about myself, I'm going to go right into the presentation. Today, it's mostly about stories that traverses many of the places that we're all coming from today. So the territories we're coming from today, and hopefully breaking some bridges, both from yesterday and today. Let me share my screen now. Okay, so I am in the musty basement of the Marx Memorial and Library in London. I find Mariana, and she's buried among posters. She's a volunteer responsible for digitizing its vast archives of posters from the various liberation struggles of the world. And I'm taken to a small office where Lenin, when in exile, spent his years writing for Iskra, or it's called Spark, the underground Bolshevik newspaper and ideological heart of the party. And so on the desk is this big tome. It collects the issues of Iskra. And on the wall, let me just try this, is framed this map that traces the distribution of the paper throughout Russia and Europe, and a reminder of the many lives risked just to get this artifact, this publication, in the hands of its readers. And looking at the tome again, you see the tightly packed Cyrillic text, and the frugality of space of the publication seems to reflect how difficult the material conditions were to produce this publication itself. And I think I challenge any sort of Instagram age activists today to sit through an issue of Iskra. It feels like the feat of reading the publication is as great as producing it. So in the same place, I find a special digest of Tricontinental, the original Tricontinental, and I'll share a bit more of that history now, based in Cuba. And this digest is dedicated to Che Guevara. It's undated, but I suspect it's from the time of the CIA-backed murder while he was in the forests of Bolivia. But it is an homage to the Comandante through the many posters, many styles, almost as many as the disguises as he had during his revolutionary life. There's one poster per page, full color, ample margins. The generosity of space and the layout seems to reflect a value for reflection and breath. And I also admire the quality of paper, the ink used, thinking about the time it was produced in, as well as the embargo of the time that has still existed since the birth of the Cuban Revolution. And so this printed artifact itself, the production, the materials and the labor that came behind its production is also an anti-imperialist assertion. So the Tricontinental Conference that happened in 1966 was organized by the Cuban people, trying to unite the liberation movements of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. It was historic. It gathered over 500 people from 82 countries and born out of the anti-colonial projects of the Non-Aligned Movement and the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization. So OSPAL, the Organization for the Solidarity with the People of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, emerged from this conference. And one of the greatest sort of masterpieces of OSPAL and the projects that they did was this publication, Tricontinental. It was a bi-monthly magazine that was provided analysis and sort of theoretical content about the people's struggles. Stokely Carmichael, one of the great leaders of the Black Panther Party, called the Tricontinental magazine a Bible in revolutionary circles. And within this, there was always this lovely folded poster that was embedded in the pages of the magazine. It was sent around the world. At its height, it had 50,000 copies of circulation. And one of the artists, Olivia Martinez, he said that this poster in the Tricontinental magazine was one of the variety of other disguises, all invented with the aim of avoiding the suppression of empire that attempted to, that all the forces they used to suppress us with every publication we produced. So these posters, these publications went where the Cuban revolutionaries couldn't go and speak. And so just very quickly looking into how, the question of how the production of the Cuban poster and graphic design came to arrive at such sophistication. And here we have the day that McCann Erickson, the global giant of advertising, and if anyone recalls the series Mad Men, it was the rival advertising firm, opened its door in Havana on this day. And it was solidifying its presence in Latin America by opening its offices in Cuba and joining it with their Mexican office. This is the same year, interestingly enough, that the US-backed dictator, Fulgencio Batista, would return to power. And in the context of Latin America, Cuba was the media capital and darling of US empire. It's where it invested a lot of infrastructure to develop radio, TV, press, very aligned with the US government and US capital. In some ways, the sophistication or the science of advertising of the 1940s, 1950s was built out from the guinea pigs of the Cuban people, where they developed market research and all the things we know now about the advertising industry. So soon after Batista, the US-backed dictator, came to power, he actually hired this firm, McCann Erickson, to run their citizen education project, or the so-called citizen education project, so that they can help restore the former glory of Cuba and help train its citizens to be more friendly to the tourists, namely the gringo tourists of the US. And here's a poster of the time, Habana Hilton, which was the largest hotel in Latin America at the moment. And we'll return to this hotel in a second. And so 1 year after Batista's return to power, in 1953, a very young teenage boy, 15 years old, Félix Beltran, started working, interning, like many people do today, at McCann Erickson. And soon after, he moved to New York City to study graphic design, painting, lithography. He started working in New York City, working for the advertising firms and developing and fine-tuning his skills from corporate America. Well, during this time, a little something was happening in Cuba, and it's what we call revolution. So remember Havana Hilton, the hotel that I had showed you just a second ago. In 1959, in January 8th, 61 years from this year, Fidel Castro and the 26th of July movement, they arrived in Havana to mark the revolution's victory. And he decided to choose this Hilton Hotel as his headquarters and hosted his press conference right here, which is a photo on the 21st of that month. And of course, they gave the hotel a new name, called it Havana Libre, or Free Havana. Like Beltran and many artists and Cuban designers that were trained in the advertising industry before the revolution and working at multinationals like McCann, overnight their context would completely change. And the state no longer has interest in selling these products for the interests of empire, but they have the means of mass communication, they have the skilled labor force. And so in some ways, these people have become the madmen and mad women of the revolution. And of course, the embargo that I mentioned still lasts today. This means that at the time, everything was in scarcity. Paper, the vast majority of paper is imported to the island, and including then. So you can imagine what that means for creating for investing the amount that they did in producing posters and publications to ship to the movements of the world. And the artistic director of Tricontinental, Alfredo Rosgaard, he said, in some ways, the embargo helped to force the artists themselves to invent new forms, that were in themselves anti-imperialists. And of course, Fidel, one of the famous lines he said was, "Our enemy is not abstract art, but imperialism." So the forms were many and diverse and inspiring for us until today. And unlike the muralist tradition of the Mexican Revolution, this was a moment of mass production, mass digital production. And it was more, the poster was a chosen form because it was more responsive to the needs and the themes of the moment. And it became an active part of visual public life on the streets, on the bulletin boards in the communities, in the rural villages, and in the living rooms of the people who had never before owned art or anything like that. So the poster was a accessible form of self-assertion and a living material culture. And returning to Felix Beltran, we had left him while he's still studying in New York. But in 1962, 3 years into the revolution, he would return to Cuba to contribute everything that he had learned and his skills and his trade to use them against the impositions of the US economic blockade and to contribute to the revolutionary struggle. And so that 15-year-old who began interning at McCann Erickson would actually become the head graphic designer for the propaganda department of the Communist Party of Cuba some years after he returned. And I think one thing that is really impressive about the Cuban experience is the utter commitment to internationalism. Here in their 1971 Congress on Education and Culture, they talk about how much the revolutionary process in Cuba is rooted not only in its national roots, in its national liberation process, but in the horizon of Latin America, Asia, and Africa, and a joint struggle against imperialism, and through which culture and artists and cultural workers play a big part. And you just look very quickly at some of the covers of the Tricontinental magazine, and you see that commitment. It's as if, you know, the commitment to the international struggles are greater than its national ones, and just in terms of the art that they were producing and the kind of messages they were sending all over the world. And as Martinez, the one of the artists that I mentioned, recounted, these publications was responding to the fundamental aim of supporting the struggles of freedom movements. And that doesn't take place only in Cuba, but around the world. And they created many things. You know, the posters also took an internationalist form or content in these Days of Solidarity posters that really reminded us that solidarity is not just an idea or a word that sounds nice to say, but also an active verb, an active process. And so many of these graphic artists collaborated with OSPAL's member countries. They received feedback. There were exchanges with liberation movements. And they were actively responding to the realities on the ground of the different places. And one of the kind of testaments to this commitment was when they sent René Medeiros, the head of their design team, to cover what was happening in Vietnam. And he wasn't there just to, well, he was sent to paint portraits of what was happening on the ground of the US imperialist war against the Vietnamese people. And he was sent in a very intense way. He spent months along the Ho Chi Minh Trail with the guerrilla fighters. And what he came back was actually these, this is an example here, poetic, colorful depictions of resistance. They were everyday portraits of, you know, the peasant struggles, about the armed struggle, and the kind of beauty and almost the playfulness of the imageries were a juxtaposition to the violence and brutality of imperialism. And these paintings were turned into silkscreen images and then national Cuban stamps upon his return. And when he was asked why he came back with these kinds of portraits of imperialism, he said they were looking towards Ho Chi Minh's revolutionary promise of a Vietnam 10 times more beautiful. And so I'm going to read a quick little poem to take us to a very other part of the world, very far from the island and another series of islands is to Indonesia. And the little poem reads like this. The little boat sails there and back and reaches Surabaya. In Cuba, they repelled the attack, Latin America being united with Afro-Asia. It's an unauthored popular form of poetry that was documented in the Harian Rakyat, which is the newspaper of the PKI, which is the Communist Party of Indonesia at the time. So I think where we're making this jump is that not only in the Cuban experience, but in Indonesia was one of the great convening moments in the 1950s and 60s of building what we call now the Third World Project. And one of the sparks of this was the 1955 Afro-Asian Conference that happened in Bandung, Indonesia. And one of the great conveners of that project was its then and first post-independence leaders, Sukarno. At that moment, the leaders of 29 newly independent or soon to become independent African and Asian states came together. They represented half of the world's population. And they were, for the first time, meeting on the South, in the territory, not actually of the colonial powers. And Lenin, he might have been writing at the time in his musty London office, that building this project, or the socialist project, is not a talisman, he said. It's the ills of the past can't be just, changed in an instant as like it's a magical word. But it begins with giving those who are formerly oppressed a chance to straighten their backs. And here's just Zhou Enlai, one of the great diplomats and leaders of the Chinese Revolution, walking in, and what was a famous moment of the Bandung Walk. And they still do that today in the Afro-Asian conferences, of bringing the different leaders on the walk towards the conference. And just to say that in the last years of Sukarno's presidency, he was getting quite close to the left flank of the non-aligned movement, one of the international platforms I mentioned briefly earlier that gave, whose seeds were planted at this very conference in 1955. And both Cuba and Indonesia were a part of that. And in those years, as he was kind of approaching a more left and anti-imperialist stance, he called also on artists and cultural workers. He understood fully that to build a robust national culture that is internationalist, the cultural work is a big part of it. And this time was the process of, in the few years after this, was the process of the Cuban Revolution. And those years in the early 60s, Indonesia and Cuba were actually coming closer together, in fact, jointly organizing what would be the Tricontinental Conference in 66. However, unfortunately, and I'll talk a little bit about what happens in Indonesia now, neither Sukarno or his party, who was a nationalist, he wasn't a communist or a socialist really, would live to see this conference happen. And why is that? So this month, Tricontinental, we just launched our latest dossier. It's a monthly publication. And every year we try to do one focused on cultural, kind of recovering some cultural and histories of movements and people's struggles. And this year is the 70th anniversary of LECRA, the Institute for People's Culture from Indonesia. That was a cultural front that was closely associated with the Communist Party of Indonesia. And it was born right alongside the independence process. And through these years of a difficult disentanglement process with the Dutch colonial and Japanese imperialist interests, it became fully independent in 1949. And out of that was born a kind of cultural cry, and many cultural organizations flourished in this moment to try to understand what would be the way forward and what role does cultural workers play in this process. And so one of the things I just want to quote, a few months after the independence, there was a kind of testimony of beliefs. A group of workers came together to talk about what is a world culture. And they said, we are the legitimate heirs of world culture, and we will perpetuate this culture in our own way. We were born out of the ranks of ordinary people. And for us, the concept of the people signifies a jumbled hodgepodge from which new, robust worlds are born. Our Indonesianness does not derive from our brown skin or our black hair. or prominent foreheads, but rather from what is expressed by the form of our own thoughts and feelings. And some of these members and others would grow into other projects like LECRA, this institute I mentioned. And LECRA is impressive that it, in its 15 years of existence, it would grow to 200,000 members with 1.5 million supporters. This is probably the largest cultural organization that has existed that isn't linked, affiliated with a kind of ruling party or a state. And they had very elaborated developments in the areas of literature, fine arts, film, theater, dance, and scientific development too. They were in the cities, they were in the countrysides, they were with the landless peasants and in the villages, in the fishing communities. And it was a very deeply integrated organization among the people's struggles of the day. And here's a painting by Emrys Natalsia called Those Chased Away from Their Land, done in 1960. Just to give a little hint of how socialist realism was taken very, very different forms in Indonesia and other parts of the world. And it was mixed with what they call the revolutionary romanticism and deeply embedded in the regional cultures and languages and artistic traditions. So in this case, and how they took this legacy forward was not so much about socialist realism that is of a specific form, but about what they called giving direction and hope. And Emrys, he lived among the central Javanese peasants and created also a lot of wood sculptures and not just paintings. His main work was actually wood sculptures, trying to depict, the realities of the displacement, some of the evictions, the land disputes that were happening, and some persecution of peasants that were trying to defend their land, which is not very unsimilar to some of the struggles we see today. And what I think was interesting in terms of these kinds of experience of living with peasants and depicting the realities that they were experiencing is how LECRA managed to develop a theory from their practice during their few short years of existence. One of the key concepts that they developed was this idea of turba, which means to descend from above, or it could be translated to going down to the masses, which is exactly what Emrys was doing. And this was concretized also, not only in the debates that the public debates they were doing in the cultural supplements of their newspaper, but also in their congresses that they were held, including the first in 1959. We had a chance to speak with Martin Aleda, who was one of the LECRA members. He was 22 years at the time, and he's a poet, and he said that he described it in his own words that it literally meant going down to the grassroots, working, eating, living with laborers. And also another thing he shared with us was how they developed a system of the three alikes. They said that you work alike, sleep alike, and eat alike. And this is how one way in their moment, this methodology they developed to intensify your own imagination as an artist and your own inspiration, and to also sharpen your feelings about how the lives of the people really were. So when I said it's 15 years of existence is because in 1965, a CIA-backed coup would end this process that was happening in Indonesia. And the coup was the coup that was backed by the CIA, for which the communists were scapegoated, led to the installation of a 32-year dictatorship under Suharto. At the time, it was a general that was probably better known by the US intelligence than to the Indonesian people themselves. And in the following months, 1 million people, up to 1 million people, they were communists or supporters that were murdered in a few short months. And of course, LECRA, and I encourage anyone who's watching this to have a look at the publication that just came out at the tricontinental.org. But LECRA, with all its promise, its cultural output, its theoretical contributions and also its organizational commitments would be destroyed in this process, and it is still banned today, and as with the Communist Party, and wouldn't live to see its national congress that was planned just a few months after the genocide that happened. So in some ways, why we're interested in telling some of these histories is that, of course, history is marked by these imperialist violences, but it's also the erasure of this history that continues that violence today. And part of the work is trying to figure out and learn from these incredible and really mass-based, internationalist-oriented organizations that was built of the people's struggles of the South. And very quickly, and I think my time is wrapping up here, and I'll share a little bit about what we're doing recently, inspired also by these historical experiences, that one of the things that grew out of, one of the platforms that grew out of the Bandung conference and the non-line movement was the Afro-Asian Writers Association. And this is one of their convening congresses that were held in Tashkent in 1958. And one of the, as a little context, a little serendipity and coincidence we only discovered after we began this process of the anti-imperialist poster exhibitions that I'll share a little and wrap up our talk here, is that in 1966, just a year after, or a few months after the coup, Afro-Asian Writers Association organized the anti-imperialist caricature exhibition, and it was held in Beijing, hosting 180 works from 24 countries on the Asian African continent. I'll get back to why this is an image from the exhibition itself, why it felt quite serendipitous that we find ourselves in the middle of a pandemic, trying to wonder what we can do, what kinds of bridging we can create, exactly what we started with, the north-south bridging, the bridging between the continents, between contexts that we live in. And I think in the introduction that we had already, the pandemic exposed to many of us the contradictions that have already existed prior to the outbreak, and of capitalism under a neoliberal order that meant that most societies are unable to respond to the needs of the people. And also to note that in many ways, many socialist-run societies have decidedly fared better, and this raises many questions for us as well. And learning from these kind of historical recoveries from Cuba to Indonesia, we also were asking from Tricontinental, how can artists respond to the needs of people's struggles right now in this moment that we're living, to articulate, to uplift, and to inspire these struggles? And taking the words from one of the principles developed by Lekra is how can we individually combine the individual creativity with the wisdom of the masses. And in speaking with an Ecuadorian muralist over these months of the pandemic, he had quoted this George Orwell quote from 1984, how can we produce work that helps us not only to stay alive, but also to stay human? And so one of the main projects that Tricontinental has been doing and in conjunction with the International Week of Anti-Imperialist Struggle was developing a series of calls for posters that we were doing in this moment. We didn't know exactly what we would be doing, but we started with saying, okay, let's call on a broad spectrum of people to show us what capitalism means to them today. So that was our first call that we launched in June of this year. The second was neoliberalism. The third, imperialism. And the fourth is on hybrid war. We didn't really know how many people would come out and respond. These are kind of almost basic concepts of our time, but also difficult concepts to express. And what we actually got in response was something quite impressive. These online exhibitions out of the series of 4 over the last 6 months, we actually had 162 artists from 30 countries and 27 organizations. Though largely from the South, they were from all corners of the world across all the continents. And we had people coming in that were first-time artists that felt inspired or invited enough to try to draw with their hands, draw with their digital tools, whatever they had access to. We had professional graphic designers. We had militants from social movements. We had a very intergenerational mixture of artists as well. People who came from national liberation struggles, including armed struggles, to today's struggles in the rural areas, to the urban peripheries of the world. We had this great story of Ramchandran, an artist in his 70s from India. He used to be a car factory worker, and he decided that he felt inspired enough since his childhood days to pick up the paintbrush and paint. And he's been one of our most avid participants in these exhibitions. And so we were very delighted with the kinds of responses we had, but also more than that, I think it showed us the utter necessity of this moment for people to trying to find ways to culturally and visually, creatively express what is happening in their realities. And we received from Congo to Cuba, from India to Indonesia, Morocco to Mexico, Palestine, Papua New Guinea. There was Cape Verde and Canada, all across Europe, North America as well. And one of the lines that Sukarno had said in the opening speech of the 1955 Bandung conference, he said, "It is the lifeline of imperialism that actually unites many of our struggles." And though 1955 might be very different and the context we live in is quite different, I think this experience showed us how much that the necessity to think and connect through a unified platform and through artistic work is powerful, and it's uplifting, it's necessary, and it's potent. And I think with that, I'm going to leave with a very short video, just a glimpse through. I invite anyone to look at the posters. They're online at the anti-imperialistweek.org, the posters that were submitted.
Esta mañana me he levantado, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Esta mañana me he levantado y he descubierto al invasor. Oh partigiano, me voy contigo. Bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Partigiano, me voy contigo porque me siento aquí morir. Y si yo caigo en la guerrilla, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Si yo caigo en la guerrilla, te dejaré mi fusil. Cava una fosa en la montaña, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao. Cava una fosa en la montaña a la sombra de una flor. Así la gente cuando la vea, oh bella ciao, bella ciao.
And so, the final thing I want to share before opening up for some questions and answer is that one of the big projects that we've been trying to do, whether it's through the historical kind of recovery and the publications we do, and the convening of artists through exhibitions like this, is really try to build an international network of artists, designers, of activists, of militants, of movements to come together. And so we also invite you all who are here watching and interested to combine individual creativity with the wisdom of the masses, as the Lekra comrades said. So Thank you very much again for inviting me and sharing, allowing me to share with this in space.
What can I say? You know, we even listened to Bella Ciao. So I have a huge thanks for you. I'm very moved, so I'm not going to be good at this. I'm not going to comment. So although I have a lot of questions, obviously, but we have questions from participants, the audience. So we're going to start with this, and I will read them out in the order I received them. Probably things you can read them out too, but for the benefit of everyone. So the first is from Alexander Strecker. I've really enjoyed this talk and the archival exploration you've taken us on. I'm curious though, per Angela's reminder in the introduction, to seek out insurrection, not resurrection, how you balance this drawing from the past with a looking towards the future. For example, I notice history is very contested, and I'm sure as someone educated in the USA that my understanding of him is deeply politicized, distorted, but I still wonder if we shouldn't raise up new icons alongside returning to Marx, Lenin, Castro, Sukarno, etc. Anyways, it's very much an open question on my part, not a critique at all. Something I'm wrestling with myself, I mean to say. But any thoughts you have on the subject would be appreciated. Thank you very much, Alexander. So, things.
No, I mean, this is doing any kind of, I think, historical work is complicated in that sense. I think where the kind of ending part or the suggestions or the kind of nuggets I was trying to drop is where can we find usefulness, or where can we find inspiration that can be responsive today. And so this was a kind of wide and ambitious journey that I took us on, to trying to connect pieces that might not be often connected, just to give a sense that maybe it's possible for us to also build connections and be as bold as maybe our previous generations were. And so in that sense, when I bring up Che Guevara or bring up any kind of historical figures, I'm trying to put them in a context of what kinds of articulations, especially Latin Americans love to use the word articulation. What kinds of platforms were they building? What kinds of connections were they able to bridge? That I think is interesting, and I think the bringing up Sukarno and what they were trying to do in the Bandung conference, there are huge lessons that we can learn if it was an imperfect process, as with what was happening with the Cuban revolutionary process till today. So there's nothing without, I think, criticism, and not even trying to duck them, but the concrete example I was trying to show was this experiment of these exhibitions of saying, okay, well, how can we reach today? We don't have the same liberation movements that are connected. We don't have the same infrastructures that were creative of that socialist era, let's say. But are there kind of seeds of hope that can be planted in us? I think there are in some ways like that, without having to raise perfect figures out of imperfect people.
Okay. I think that it's very interesting that the images that you showed are two-dimensional, and I have to note that we're locked in a two-dimensional dimension, as we speak. And to me, this at least reframes the whole question of the two-dimensional image for use in our lockdowns. And of course, I mean, there is an insurrection without the streets. There's no question about that. But in this crisis, maybe two-dimensionality needs to be brought up and brought back. So I'll move to the second question, which is from, if I'm not mispronouncing it, Stanley Volukau Vanamba. I'm very sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name. Thank you for sharing your work today. I very much appreciate it. I'm curious to hear you talk more about the ways that the mobilization of political affinities between different national groups manifested in the iconography and imagery you track in Tricontinental. Can you speak to that, the way the image worked as a site for mobilizing and manifesting transnational affinities? And if there is scope, can you speak more to the different practices of using the publication across geographies? That is, to the specific differences of use that emerge from this sort of publication? Thank you for this question.
I'll share one story. I mean, maybe trying to see if I can connect back from what Tricontinent was doing, where it arrived to, and also some nice serendipitous encounters that happened in the exhibition process. Is that one of the artists that contributed to all 4 series of the exhibitions. Her name is Judy Seidman, and she was a participated a militant, let's say, of the National Liberation Struggle, and she was exiled in Botswana, where many of the South African revolutionaries were staying. And she formed part of a group called the Medu Arts Ensemble. It's incredible history, and I urge anyone to look into that. And there are stories in that when people were out there in the kind of exiled camps, organizing culture, but also linked to the struggles of the moment, she shared with me, there were times that they would just wait for the Tricontinental magazine to just arrive, and somehow someone would smuggle it through the border. Someone, posters were like a weapon, really, of the images that you could be able to, two-dimensional physical image, let's say, how you can get it to, the townships within South Africa. How can you understand what is happening from Cuba to, liberation struggle in Angola to what was happening in China? This is the kind of form it had. And so there are still living stories of that. People waiting for the poster to arrive in their hands and studying them, reading the text. And of course, it was a great honor for us that she contributed to the exhibitions themselves, and we get to carry on a little bit of that legacy. And what was quite nice, bringing it back to South Africa, is one of the great social movements of today is called Abahlali, which is the shack dwellers movement. And this, during the pandemic, they faced a lot of the repressions, the displacements and of the shacks and that kind of thing during the pandemic moment, which is an extra level of state brutality. But they managed to celebrate their 15-year anniversary in their first urban occupation. And there they decided, and some comrades actually just sent us images, and we didn't know about it. The people were decorating the 15-year hall, the space for the 15-year anniversary, and they had chosen many of the posters to print and post on to decorate the exhibition hall. They chose art from Lebanon to a poster from Cuba to all kinds of places, because for them, these were representations that had an affinity, let's say, a transnational affinity with the realities they lived. And lo and behold, what was also really nice is that I saw a picture where also Judy's own work ended up back traveling around the world and back in South Africa on the walls of this hall for the celebration. So just as a little story of how from historical moment to a contemporary moment, how these two-dimensional images, as you say, can build, mobilize, and also build affinities across territories that we couldn't imagine.
We have some more questions here, and 2 minutes to read them out and answer them. So the first is from Alexander Supartono. Thank you for a brilliant presentation. I agree with that. Do you see those historical works resonating in the visual language of contemporary artist activists, particularly in Cuba and Indonesia, respectively?
I mean, I can't speak for sufficiently for the contemporary art landscape of those two places. But one of the things that I did learn from some young graphic artists from Cuba today is obviously when we do some of this historical work, there's also a thought of, well, we can't just be held back to what we were doing in 1959, 1960s, 1970s. Like the language of our visual production has changed. And of course, I'm biased towards the graphic arts, the visual arts, has changed significantly. And so what was actually, back to the exhibitions, really exciting is we got some of the largest contributions was from Cuba. And so maybe to answer that question, you can see some of those legacies today, but also how much that I would say one of the most impressive graphic histories, traditions of Cuba have continued to develop and advance. And some of our really most creative forces, I think, would come from Cuba. But I think that's my personal bias.
Okay, we have a few more moments, or minutes rather, I'm told. So, but more questions keep coming in, and I lost track. I know there was one. Okay, from Linnemore and Neft, could we look further than specific male in brackets icons, heroes, to a recognition and acceptance of non-hierarchical groups?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think in the publications we do, and I didn't have enough time to share more about LECRA, the focus was really on the not on the individuals, but very much on the organizational capacities. In order to build an organization where you have members of 200,000 people, that's a pretty it's beyond just the kind of charismatic individual leaders. That's something that is and we actually talk about how is it, for instance, not just male, but like how women leaders organize among the women's fronts, among the fisherwomen. How is that linked deeply with how they organize the very, let's say, popular based cultural nights in the cities, the theater groups in the cities? How is that organized in conjunction with the kind of educational processes that were happening on the rural areas? So very much, I mean, as much as the posters we kind of bring back, or the history we bring back has these individuals as icons that we recognize, the things that we're really interested in, the political process that they developed, much broader beyond those individuals. Unfortunately, didn't have enough time to share more of that today.
And we don't have much time to answer questions, but we've got two more, and I think this the last two we will accept for this talk, unfortunately. One is from Pauline Berman. Thank you for mentioning Tami Mniele and the Medu Group. We made, okay, that's more of a comment. We made big exhibition in 2009 in the Jagerli about the Medu Group. In the Netherlands, there is the Tami Mniele Foundation Residency Award, which is great. We exist 30 years today. That's fabulous. Thank you, Pauline. I don't know if you have a comment on this thing. So.
I never got to see it's at the Johannesburg Art Gallery, but I never got to see exhibition. But I have the monograph.
Okay, and I can say the next one is a question. It has a question mark at the end, and it's from Jonas Stahl, who is also a speaker in 2 days' time. Saying thank you for this essential people's history of art in insurrection and revolution. A critique often waged by the liberal art establishment is that when art and culture become inherent parts of transformative politics, this would be mere propaganda. Filipino art historian Alice Guillermo embraced this term instead, building on the history of social realism in the anti-dictatorship movement in her country, and emphasize the need to propagate in terms of mass cultural education, agitation, and imagination. And in your view, things, can we reclaim propaganda as a field of emancipatory artistic and cultural work?
Yeah, no, it's a wow, excellent question. I mean, a short answer is yes, let's do it. No, I mean, that's a flippant answer. No, I think this is a struggle we have. In terms of bringing any of this, let's say, people or popular art or revolutionary art is always undermined from the kind of liberal perspective of that it exists in a kind of subcategory or a different type of discussion. And of course, I think is of the opinion, and also this whole project with Tricontinental doing this historical recovery is of course not, it can't be. I mean, then there is no particular function of why we should create any kind of art, whether it's visual or any kind of a form, if it has no response or no, let's say the word was use affinity with real people. And so if that means it's called propaganda, and I think it's good word then. And also, and the I would say the Latin language is the word propaganda takes on a slightly different form. I don't think it has been as necessarily, I don't know, villainized as much as in English has been. So there's still some hope in different languages as well.
I think you're right, and I should probably say that the person who asked this question has written an excellent book on propaganda and art. So I wanted, if we have a few more minutes, we do. Marina is nodding. Okay, that's great. So if we have a few minutes, I have some questions. I wanted to understand better the idea of hybrid war and how you disseminate this more difficult concept in approaching people for posters. I don't know if others here have this question. So that was my question.
Specifically on the hybrid war?
Yeah. Like if you could just expand on the concept and.
Yeah, I mean, we left hybrid war for the last because we realized we needed a warm-up period. Like, okay, seems like let's start with capitalism. It's not more simple, but let's start with something. Hybrid war we left at the end. And I think one of the ways that we there's a whole curatorial team that was part of organizing this. So we're trying to also do it in a way to provide for us to clarify with the help of artists what these concepts mean for mums. So in terms of hybrid war, we gave with each one, we gave a short description, a short, let's say, definition that was collectively crafted of how hybrid war was. I don't have it in front of me to exactly tell you now. But to talk about the non-conventional ways that war takes place now, often in terms of how and the mutations of imperialism, it's not necessarily troops at, physically, crossing your borders. It's many different things that we've seen as, let's say it's the media misinformation, the spread of fake news, how social media can be used, how lawfare can be used. We saw this in experience in Brazil, how lawfare is used more than maybe military is used to depose a government. Obviously, I mentioned the media apparatus. It's also about diplomatic or economic sanctions. It can take the form, take place of trade sanctions. So all those other forms that war takes place, which defines many of the regions from, say, Venezuela to Cuba to even now thinking about trade war between US and China. These kinds of and then we also provided different kinds of reading materials because we thought it'd be interesting to also deepen the process for our understanding.
I think there's going to be a kind of like great ideological victory, if I can put it this way, if if war becomes properly, in popular terms, redefined so as to encompass, for instance, the role of technology. And I say this because you mentioned like social media and so on, which is much more in everyday reality. And I mean, there's so many parallel conversations and attachments, and I would say Brutus, even within the left. For instance, there was this very important point, this idea of staying human, right? Not just staying alive, but staying human. And of course, I mean, the idea of the posthuman is kind of like taking over academia, for instance, and so on. The left does take part in it, etc. And I find it extremely important to carry on using this phrase, to stay human, not just alive, as a counterpoint, not just to further the debates within the left, but because we need to know who it is we're fighting for. I mean, if there is a futurity to struggles, which is part of what we're examining here, is like, who is the struggle for? And so, I think that helped clarify it. And of course, it reminded me of what the refugees in Greece say often. They say, we're human, we need to be treated as human. And this is really the voice of the subaltern. This is really the definition, the self-definition they claim. So I think it needs to be made clearer and louder. Okay, if we don't have any more questions, and I think we're running out of time anyway with the wonderful talk, and very, very moving for me at least, approach that you took things. I don't know if I want to thank you very much for being with us tonight and for sharing your absolutely incredible knowledge and experience. There's a lot of these things that at least I heard for the first time. So, and I'm an historian, which is bad already, you know. Okay, so I don't know. Thank you. Marina, I don't know if we're not taking a break. I think we're moving on, or are we taking
about 5 minutes? We have 5 minutes. The next presentation starts at 6:15 Rotterdam time.
Yes,
so
that's what
5 minutes breaks, everyone, for whatever you need, and then we are back.
Okay, fine.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. So Kevin, you're here. We'll see you in 5
Angela,
minutes.
and the organizers.
Bye-bye for 5 minutes. Okay. Don't know if we're ready to start. I want to welcome Kevin. Hi.
How are you doing? Thank you.
Great to see you. I'll introduce you first.
Right.
So I'm really delighted that our second speaker is Kevin Okoth, whose articles for the journal I read meticulously, called Salvage, have been an inspiration for many, me included. I'm referring to The Flatness of Blackness, Afro-Pessimism, and the Erasure of Anti-Colonial Thought, in particular from January of this year, 2020, if I'm not mistaken. And Oftehen's Populist Revolt, Local Patriotism, and the Left Behind Left, which is more recent from the summer. Kevin is an independent writer and researcher living in London, and he holds an MPhil in political theory from the University of Oxford, and he writes on imperialism and 20th century anti-colonial struggles. His talk tonight is titled The End of Radicalism, African Socialism, and the Struggle for Anti-Imperialist Sovereignty. And the virtual floor is yours, Kevin. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Angela, for inviting me to speak, and also to Marina. And thank you to Ting Shak for a really, really beautiful talk. I really, really enjoyed that. So just picking up on, I think, one of the last things before I share my screen that was mentioned during the question, during the last Q&A, I'm very much interested in this talk, and in general as well, on the imperfect process of liberation and kind of some of the things that went wrong at the moment of basically national liberation. So I think what I'm trying to do in this talk is look back and kind of do reevaluate certain specific moments in the history of liberation movements in Africa, and basically where they went wrong. And I think my focus is going to be mainly on 3 Eastern African countries, so Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique. But I think the main thing I want to the main terms in which I want to reevaluate these national liberation movements is in two aspects that have often been brought up as their most prominent failures. The first one of these is the establishment of popular democratic structures, or post-capitalist democratic structures, and the failure to be able to establish those during the national liberation struggle. And the second one is the failure to gain sovereignty over natural resources and control over economic structures. So they're often seen now retrospectively as failing on these two aspects. But I think I'd like to look further into why this failure happened. And I think for that, I want to bring up what I call the end of radicalism, which is a phrase that I've taken from a Kenyan scholar, which kind of consisted of an erasure of a more radical political tradition at that time, which coincided with the establishment of what we would refer to as neo-colonial relations in those countries. So I'm just going to share my screen quickly. All right. So I'd like to speak more about where the inspiration for looking at this a little bit closer came from. Partially, it's from more recent debates that have been going on. And I think one of the people who has addressed this is Mahmoud Mandani in a recent book called Neither Settler Nor Native. So what he addresses is basically to reconceptualize or think about the nation state. What he says is that realizing a better world means that we must recognize the world we live in, which is a world that's structured by the nation state, and so fundamentally structured by the nation state. And the way he says the nation state works is through the politicization of identity under structures of the nation state. So the way the nation state is structured is that the power always lies with those who identify with the nation, and not with other coalitions that might assemble through different political processes of struggle. So it's always a majority that identifies with the nation that dominates a minority. So he says that only by decoupling the nation from the state can there be true democracy or people's sovereignty. The second aspect of his argument is that the nation imagines, again, the state as its protector, and the state fulfills this function. So the nation state is born to serve the nation and is indispensable to the nation itself. So it's basically what I said, that minority can only, so I think what he's concerned with specifically is kind of in post-colonial states, or what he refers to as post-colonial. But like Angela said, if we find ourselves in that situation, is questionable. That minorities can only pursue political reform through violence in that situation. So he says that only by decoupling the nation from the state can we escape this kind of particular form of political violence. So he kind of traces it back to the survival of indirect rule in colonized, and basically how colonized subjects took on a nationalist political subjectivity. So he sees the problem in the kind of ideology of the nation, or the concept of the nation state that kind of reinforces post-colonial political violence. So the trouble here is that trying to get past the conception of sovereignty, in which freedom remains basically tied to the nation, and reinforces this process of post-colonial violence. So Mamdani's solution is pretty much that only through the decolonization of the political can we really kind of achieve equity and move past this permanent majority and minority status. So the starting point then for decolonization is to rethink political identity as a political community and how it relates to the nation. So another scholar who has recently addressed kind of this debate is Adam Getachew, who locates the fall of self-determination in two developments. And I think she's also trying to think precisely why kind of some of the national liberation movements turned into basically what she calls a minimalist defense of the state. So she locates the fall of self-determination in two developments: an increasingly critical orientation of Western intellectuals and politicians towards the right to self-determination, and the second, the curtailing of international institutions, for example, the UN, where anti-colonial nationalists had staged what she calls their world-making. And I think this is a pretty crucial aspect, because people like Eduardo Mondlane, who's a Mozambican revolutionary, and Amilcar Cabral from Guinea-Bissau, and many others use the UN to generate support for the independence struggle in the international arena. So what happened is basically that these developments set the stage for resurgence of international hierarchy, an further expansion of US imperialism. And at the same time, where US imperialism was expanding again, basically the resources of anti-colonial nationalism seemed to be exhausted, and it kind of fell short of the egalitarian aspirations that it had posited at the moment of decolonization. So what began as an effort to rethink sovereignty as a broader concept basically culminated in projects that reinforced this international order in the nation state. But I think she encourages us to think very much how self-determination also did mark a radical break from a Eurocentric model of international society, and established the idea of non-domination, which was first articulated by the Bolsheviks as well, as the central idea of a post-imperial world. So that's why we need to tie the notion of independent and equal states to anti-imperialism and the demand for inclusion that was articulated in the image of that egalitarian world order. So I think what the central question that I want to ask today also is, during decolonization, there existed alternative kind of ways, or more democratic ways of articulating the relationship or the nation state. And I want to, on the centrality of kind of basically popular democracy for Marxist and anti-imperialist movements in Africa between the 1960s, or like the early 1960s and 1975. But I think where my phrase, the end of radicalism, or like the phrase, the end of radicalism comes in, it's kind of thinking about what happened to those alternatives. So the end of radicalism, that's a phrase, it was first, or I kind of first came across it by, in a book by a Kenyan academic called Onibari Omaloba. And the book is called The Anatomy of Neocolonialism in Kenya. And it's pretty much an analysis of the Kenyatta rule, who was the first post-independence president of Kenya, and his elimination of the radical opposition between 1963 and about 1978. And I think what he defines as the end of radicalism is the basic suppression of a socialist faction around someone called Jaramogi Oginga Odinga and another radical called Pio Pinto. But I think it's a phrase that can also be used to describe various developments in post-independence movements across the continent. That's kind of a political process, this end of radicalism, that happened quite frequently during that period of time. So I think one of the examples that is quite prominent in, or kind of that is good to look at also in terms of this end of radicalism, is the process of Tanzanian independence and its relation basically to the Zanzibari revolution. So Walter Rodney, who's an anti-imperialist historian who was basically spent time in Tanzania at the time, had this very interesting analysis of Julius Nyerere's Ujamaa socialism, basically to explain how the term African socialism in the 1960s compromised a number of interpretations, ranging from people who actually wanted to go down a socialist route, and those who wanted to maintain colonial relations. The term is often now today is associated with Tom Mboya, who is a Kenyan MP who articulated a particular program of African socialism, and Leopold Senghor, who we know maybe as the Negritude poet and first president of Senegal. But that's kind of the way it's popularly known now, is taken to mean a set of relations where capitalism and imperialism are left entirely unchallenged. While Rodney accepts that Nyerere might have been more revolutionary than Senghor or Mboya, he does not say that Ujamaa is synonymous with Marxism or communism, which are held at arm's length by Nyerere and his supporters. So this focus on communalism that was there at the beginning and at the first process of independence disregarded various problems that would come up, like limited distribution or the restriction of also low levels of production, and it didn't really address those problems. So this kind of African socialism articulation, the articulation of African socialism as a third way, sought to break with foreign domination through a return to a pre-colonial classless society, so a mythical rural past which was based on idealized principles of love between human beings, the right to work and share what is produced equally, the shunning of private ownership. And these, so Nyerere articulated them as principles that have been undermined by foreign intervention, which have brought with it monetary economy and ideas of individual ownership, for example. But it also meant that, which is the critique that the left wing, the Zanzibari revolutionaries had of African socialism, it also meant that economic power was entirely centralized in the hands of the government, and that the party penetrated into the economy. It also meant that the repression of alternative political and economic vision. So as Amrit Wilson, who's wrote an excellent book on the Zanzibari revolution, pointed out, the key slogan was self-reliance, but in reality, it was much more about austerity and control. So just to kind of point out this process of the end of radicalism. So during the Zanzibari revolution, Nyerere was under pressure from the US and the UK to help neutralize Zanzibar, because the Zanzibari revolution basically threatened, or they were scared that it would go into a communist direction led by the Umma party, who was basically calling for socialism. And but he felt obligated to the imperialist powers for assistance, because which was basically a mutiny that took place at barracks in Dar es Salaam. He'd relied on the US and the UK to suppress that mutiny. So he decided then also to help neutralize Zanzibar. as the political union of basically the Federation of Tanzania, the Union of Tanganyika and Zanzibar was founded, it kind of became clear that what it was not Pan-Africanism, but more a pragmatic move to ensure internal stability in the country and to kind of move away from the image of being the own administration. So Pan-Africanism in this sense was more a way to rebuild a radical image and do support of liberation movements, but not actually a way to bring about a certain type of change. So Zanzibar kind of was given only a limited regional autonomy, and the articles that determined the union's control over the Zanzibari Isles were not ratified by the actual revolutionary council that was participating in the Zanzibari revolution. So someone who was very involved in the early revolution was A.M. Babu, who was then transferred, who was basically put into the Ministry of Economic Planning, but was never given any actual power. And the policy, the actual economic policy of the union was drafted and implemented by a French director of planning. And the development policy remained basically entirely in the hands of non-Zanzibaris and non-Tanzanians. There was also an increasing tension and repression in the 1970s, which culminated in the arrest of, in the 1970s. And Karume, who was then the VP, was assassinated by two ex-members of the Communist Umma Party. So mass arrests followed, and there was an attempt to have A.M. Babu extradited to Zanzibar, and he was eventually imprisoned on the mainland. But Babu's trial again was dominated by his contempt for his communist politics, and that kind of overshadowed the entire trial, and that's why he was eventually imprisoned. So I think just the historical example of the Zanzibari revolution shows how there's a more moderate form of African socialism that came to dominate at the moment of independence through the suppression of a more radical alternative that was positing a different kind of economic structure, but also a different way of organizing politically and a different conception of democracy. Recently also, there's another author, John Saul, who is a historian of and an analyst of Southern Africa and the liberation movements, has also been interested in kind of the end of radicalism. In his case, he was looking at the developments in Mozambique. I think one thing that he really gets right is that what he was looking at is that there's been too little theoretical or substantial concern given to political assassinations in this kind of like, in what we'd call the end of radicalism. The second point he also makes that's important, I think, is that he analyzes the trajectory of Frelimo, which was the Mozambican National Liberation Party, and its kind of gradual drift into a sort of post-independence authoritarianism that wasn't based on popular democratic structures and took those for granted. So first, in terms of political assassinations in that process, both leaders of the Mozambican revolution, Eduardo Mondlane, who was the first president of Frelimo, and Samora Machel, who was his successor after his assassination, were both killed. Mondlane first by the Portuguese defense apparatus, and his successor Machel later through collaboration with the South African apartheid state. And it's often these political leaders were eliminated for a reason. Basically, also Mondlane was feared by the Portuguese, for instance, for his organizational capacity and the shift to a more radical economic approach, which warranted special attention and basically made him a threat to the established order. So I think the question that Saul asks is, so where do these leaders fit in, and what does it do when such people are removed? And I think he doesn't want to go into maybe what we were talking about earlier, which is a hero worship or something of the sorts. But I think he does say that these leaders gave hope in some ways to make possibilities of change possible. and that the political assassination is employed as a tactic for the removal of such hope. And I think we see this all across the continent during that period of time, not just with Monlan and Machel, but also with Pinto in Kenya, and Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, and various other cases. So, so what happened in the Mozambican revolution is that there was a rapid kind of unraveling of the revolution, and the curtailing of any democratic empowerment of popular forces, crackdown on mass organizations, including the Women's Organization of Women, Mozambican Women, trade unions. And this kind of like, this partly was related to the Frelimo's emphasis on vanguardism and a firm sense of the party's historical certainty. So the question then we ask is, was the most fundamental flaw in its project its broader weakness in the sphere of democratic theory and practice? And but I think the main question here is, so there's oftentimes when we look at Zanzibar as well, when we look at Kenya in that case, and when we look at Mozambique, there's a structure of, or there's a pattern to be recognized, which is oftentimes that there's people who are just nationalists, who are opposed to those with more radical hopes for what a post-liberation world might look like, which is kind of, it's a recurrent story in the sphere of African liberation struggles. So someone like Monlan, for instance, if we read his book with The Struggle for Mozambique, it kind of is very clear that there's that he avoids the imposition of rigid dogmas or hierarchies and kind of allows for a more free interplay of conflicting views and positions. And that basically his Marxism-Leninism remains framed by the insistence that the Frelimo liberation project cannot exist outside of or above the Mozambican people. And I think, oh, just a second, I think that's the wrong slide. Oh yeah, so I think to kind of find a more democratic element of these revolutionary nationalist movements, we can somehow go back also to the liberated zones, which is during the Mozambican revolutionary struggle. There were popular democratic structures that were established in areas that were liberated through military action during the independence war. And these liberated zones became spaces for experimentation with new and radical forms of social relations that were basically thought to form the basis for a future independent state. The transformation of socioeconomic relations in the liberated zones included women as military leadership, agricultural production devoted to the needs of the population, or barter replacing currency. But these were also crucial sites of cultural resistance to colonialism. But with kind of the end of radicalism, those kind of experiments were pushed aside and a more kind of rigid form of post-independence nationalism was emphasized based on vanguardism and basically on erasure of that democratic tradition. I think, so the crisis of the African state, which is kind of what I've been trying to get at in this talk, is that, so Eleni Zilek in her book, Ethiopian Theory, kind of articulates this tripartite or three reasons for the crisis of the African state. The first of which is the survival of indirect rule. The second is the persistence of customary law. And the third is the reification of tribe, ethnicity, or nationalities. But she also explains that these explanations are insufficient. So the problem is not only to escape the legacies of colonialism, but also to transcend the peripheral inclusions of these nation states into the capitalist world economy. So today, kind of linking with the conference theme, imperialism today turns on the affirmation of Southern countries, and I think this is something that the late political economist Samir Amin emphasized, is that the battle turns on Southern countries' sovereignty over resources and their commitment to prioritizing internal development and fighting against super exploitation. which involves the struggle of the people, of the popular classes, of nations, of historical realities that have developed their particular personality, and states, powers wielded in the name of the nation, of those nations by the ruling class. So given kind of that is a requirement today, it means that we need to rethink what the nation means in this contemporary struggle against imperialism, and but also the class relations within those particular nations. So I think it's always crucial in this question to return to Cabral and his conception of the nation class. So Cabral says that under colonialism, the main class contradiction is between internal and external supporters of imperialism, and the masses as a nation class. But because the potential for revolution lies in an alliance of various classes, including, for instance, the peasantry and the petty bourgeoisie, there have to be other steps taken after formal independence. So the first step would be the anti-colonial revolution. The second is the emergence of a class society. And the second is a socialist and a socialist democratic revolution. The third step requires that the petit bourgeois vanguard of the independence movement commit what he calls class suicide, meaning that it must sacrifice its class position, privileges, and power through identification with the working masses. If this does not happen, then the revolution will inevitably result in authoritarian statism or state capitalism. But class suicide can only happen if the material experiences of the leaders are formed in the institutional structures of radical socialist democracy, the basis of which is laid during the armed struggle. In the neo-colonial situation, however, the struggle for the independent state and political power is between the working class, the native working class, and imperialist capital. Under neo-colonialism, the society is now structured under vertical lines, making it difficult to build cross-class coalitions against imperialism. The material and psychological effects then of the emergence of sharp class contradictions demobilize nationalist forces and enable other ties such as tribal solidarity to make their way back into politics. So it's now the popular classes on the ground fighting both the native and imperialist bourgeoisie, with no strictly nationalist solution to be found. The only option then is to posit a socialist solution on an international level that begins with the destruction of capitalism and imperialist structures implanted in national soil. So I think the warning from Cabral here is basically, if we go back and look at the end of radicalism, it's warning that nationalist solution is no longer possible in the neo-colonial context, which is kind of what we see in Zanzibar with the end of radicalism, or in the Kenyan case. So the essence of basically the neo-colonial state is that it's theoretically independent, has all the features of sovereignty, but in reality, its economic system and political policy are directed from outside. This compromises the essence of national sovereignty and the evolution of internal politics and institutions. So I think the question I wanted to ask is, how do we articulate struggles today beyond the nation state? How does the nation state in the global south fit into this, into the broader structure of imperialism? And I think there's questions that basically many post-independence governments failed to ask themselves, and even during that period, during the 1960s, is really a disregard for kind of both the establishment of those popular democratic structures and the ability to really gain control over natural resources and economic structures. I think just to finish off, if we look at places today, like Tanzania, where Julius Nyerere is often held up as basically a hero of the anti-colonial revolution. Today, there's still a lot of exploitation in gold mining. There's a reliance on primary commodity exports in agriculture, including cash crops, for example, cloves, which they've always been dependent on the export for. And there's oil and gas reserves with all major oil companies operating in Tanzania. In Mozambique, there's this is a similar state. There's a discovery of huge gas depots in Mozambique, basically in Cabo Delgado, where the revolution initially started. And basically they're being exploited by transnational corporations. But the ruling party is still Frelimo, which is the revolutionary party and the heir to basically the Mozambican revolution. In Kenya, the case is it's still a bastion of capitalism in East Africa, very much representative of US interests in the region, and still relies a lot on primary commodities for export, and the discovery of oil recently and other minerals basically make it likely that it will continue to be an export-reliant economy. So I think the question that I really wanted to ask is, how does the end of radicalism impact where these nation states find themselves today within the context of imperialism? And what was the alternative articulation of a political program that was voiced by more radical left factions at the time? And I think if we do return to them, we can salvage a conception of anti-imperialism that is both concerned with the sovereignty of resources and the control over economic structures, but also with the establishment of post-capitalist democratic structures during that can then serve as the basis for a post-capitalist society. I think, what am I on in time?
Yeah, you're good for a bit.
Okay, yeah. What's my timing? Sorry, I think I went through it very quickly.
The slides helped a lot. If you can conclude, sorry for not having the camera on. So Kevin, if you need to add something, you can do so, or there is a bit of time. Okay, yeah, perfect. So I think what I was really trying to ask is how during a particular moment in African history and during the national liberation struggles, those movements that sought to expose the contradictions in bourgeois ideology and colonialism, to show that it's incompatible with the hierarchies of exclusion and exploitation, how they basically ended up folding back into neo-colonial societies that served precisely those purposes. And I think the main thing is that taking seriously, for instance, political assassinations as a mechanism for making the erasure of a radical political tradition that was articulating a different political program during that time. Okay. If you have concluded rather.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
Okay, that's fabulous, and thank you very much, Kevin. It's for me, it's a kind of like mind-blowing talk because it opened up a whole history. I mean, normally we hear much more about the critique of colonialism, of colonial powers from the outside, rather than getting a kind of internal history of struggles. So I think this articulation, this in your presentation of this, I would think for many people, unknown history is extremely important as a learning ground. And I'm also pleased in some ways that you started with the idea of failing, the imperfect revolutions. I see these things as two different things. I mean, you can have an imperfect revolution, but it wouldn't necessarily kind of like wrap up, you know, it wouldn't necessarily end in failing. But here you have provided a number of examples of why self-determination with self-determination in terms of the nation state did not become possible. You know, it really wasn't possible. And of course, we're talking about, or at least I as a historical materialist, it doesn't mean that in the future, right, this could be repeated. So my question to you for now is, whether you think that the same processes in Africa, for instance, are condemned to the same kind of failure. I mean, or whether you think that slight variations or a different use of the nation could lead in the 21st century somewhere else to a different result.
So that's the question I'm kind of, which is something I've been thinking about a lot recently, or just kind of trying to get to the bottom of, is what is the use still of the nation in this particular context? Because I think there's a lot of more like kind of what Mahmoud Mandani is saying is more a dismissal of the nation. And I think he goes back a lot to looking at, for instance, the Mozambican revolutionary struggle and saying that its kind of use of a certain articulation of nationalism it basically stifles a democratic process. Because for him, it's kind of nationalism is always kind of associated with this process of majorities and minorities and exclusion. But then, you know, if we look back at kind of even the first presentation we were seeing, if we look back at the kind of contributions of some ideas of the nation to basically a third worldist project, I think it becomes more important to rethink whether there is still a value in that kind of conceptual category, even today for those liberation struggle or for movements for national liberation in Africa, for instance. I think the second point that I always want to bring up is kind of the natural resource angle, which is oftentimes there. I find it difficult to think about that because it depends a lot on kind of some conception of sovereignty over those resources to some extent, and how we can kind of articulate a struggle for those resources through a framework that is not the nation state. That's yeah.
I know, but I think that I mean, we see very good reason. I think the paradigm, you know, the example of Africa, the narrative that you, or rather the history that you presented, shows very well why capital, far from diluting the nation, it has actually kept it very much alive. And despite all the imperialism and so on, I think there was, not only in Africa, I mean, I can speak about the European or the European Union more specifically experience, where which in some ways is disintegrating, and there is an articulation of, I mean, nationalism, which plays a huge role here. And I think that the very idea of the nation disallows perhaps an alternative globalization, if I can put it this way, you know, from being completed. So it's very purposefully maintained. But I think that the problem that Africa, rather the imperialism in Africa with its resources and so on, I mean, is it feasible? I mean, is it conceivable to think that ever some kind of power, because I think we're at a moment in globalization where we are having, you know, for a few years now, a kind of new articulation of imperialism, where we have Asia also playing a role, and so on, and other countries even, from other parts of the world. So, I mean, is it possible with the wealth of Africa to imagine an Africa that is not kind of like grabbed by the war for resources that capitalism requires for its reproduction, really, the growth? I mean, so much comes from Africa.
I think plainly. So I think that's the difficult question that I'm trying to pose in relation to the African states, basically, and what their role is in, or what can communist movements or socialist movements do to ensure that those resources are not exploited in that way. So I think if that makes sense. No, if that makes sense. And I think there's something also in the history, for instance, of the tricontinental that is very, very valuable for that process of just kind of basically South-South cooperation, economic cooperation, that is like a step towards protecting those.
It is, but there is also, I mean, to this, I need to say that there is also a South in Europe, for instance, and I don't mean necessarily, you know, well, Greece is a very particular case because it was seen, you know, during the global financial crisis, the weak link, more than Spain, although Spain and Portugal and some other countries came into this. The thing is that there's always the card played that you're still over and above Africa. So no matter how weak you are, what you need to do is like stop the refugees or, you know, migrants from that continent, kind of like lock it down in its own, in its suffering under imperialism, and just elevate yourself by Greece by identifying with like the colonial, you know, powers. So there's some kind of like class relation indeed here between nations, which is very purposefully and carefully maintained, that the south of Europe, the working class south of Europe, will just be told that it's different from, it's very different. It kind of lives through a different kind of poverty, more elevated poverty than the African people. And I don't know, with the emergence of something that feels like fascism, you know, in Europe, I would say, no matter what we call it, and the nationalism that fuels it, because it all has to do with that. It's really a discourse about the purity of our civilization and so on. I mean, this is popular media, TV discourse that we're getting, at least in Greece, like all the time. And I know that also in the UK, which of course that's how we got certain results. So, so I wanted to ask your view about this, and then I'll just open it. I see we have some questions from the audience, I think. I mean, do you see some hope there? If you don't need, I'm all for failure and...
you mean particularly in Europe as well?
I mean, how to overcome this very careful, precisely the idea of the nation that fuels fascism, that necessarily articulates a hierarchy of the oppressed.
Yeah. That is a really difficult question.
Okay. I'll give you, you can think about it, and I'll give you some questions from the audience then.
All right.
In the order they appear. From Megan Hedger, I think is the first one. It says, thanks, Kevin, for a great presentation. Can you say a bit more about the cultural resistance that was happening in liberated zones in the Mozambique revolution? Also, maybe about the relation of the democratic structures established in those zones to ideas of council communism, communalism, and so forth.
So I think just in terms of the kind of cultural resistance, it's a lot of kind of the resurgence of basically people's languages and songs. And it's actually just within the kind of Mozambican nationalist revolution, there was a lot of kind of a re-articulation of people's basically ethnic identities, even from those different regional places. So there was a lot of kind of poetry. And I think the cultural resistance, I think a lot is in an interesting way, I think poetry played a particularly important role in the liberated zones, and kind of people learning to read and write poetry and basically reciting poetry to each other, the liberation, in the liberated zones. So I think it's kind of those, and I think if one looks at the kind of the Mozambican revolution, there's a lot of basically people who fought in the liberation struggle who came to it unable to read or write, and kind of learned in those liberated zones through poetry, and took on prominent positions in the post-independence government as well. I think in relation to the democratic structures, particularly that were established in their relations to council communism, communalism, I think there's not enough research that I'm aware of that really links the exact structures of those democratic spaces to kind of more theoretical discourses around council communism, for instance. But I think it's basically an avenue that I would like to go down a lot more.
There's another question from Karin Abdurrahmanov, asking, what influence do you think regional organizations have on the expression of anti-capitalist arguments? Do they absorb it?
I mean, it depends on what shape and form regional organizations take. Because if we're looking at, for instance, if we go back to I don't know if it's meant, the question is meant in that way, but if we go back to the 1960s, for instance, there was an attempt to kind of create a regional bloc between Zanzibar, Tanganyika, so Zanzibar and Tanganyika together, then as Tanzania, Kenya, and also further south towards Mozambique, to create some sort of regional bloc that was like, but that was a moderate kind of bloc that was basically supportive of imperialist interests, particularly US and UK interests in the region. So I don't think there's, with regional organizations, there's not necessarily an anti-capitalist expression within those regional organizations, I think. So it fully depends on what types of organizations they are and in what way they're established.
If by regional we mean transnational in a way, which is the way I interpreted yeah, but I mean, wouldn't this create, I mean, this is my only hope for regional organizations, in the sense that there might at least be some kind of support, so that the people of a nation state, I mean, we can look at Cuba for what's been happening there, you know, for decades, are not alone in battling capitalism, and this has to do with sharing resources, possibly, but also with actually psychological factors. I think even at the level of free movement of people, it would be important to have a larger coalition of revolutionary forces. I think this played, if we look at the recent history of Europe, I think one of the problems, but not the only one, was that, you know, you have the election, you can go as far as having a kind of like, even, let's say, they would call it radical left, but moderate left party, and then everyone else, all the other countries where there is an uprising or something, they have their elections 10 months later, and in these 10 months, the left of that one country has been taken down. It doesn't take more, because really the force is very brutal, and it's a huge thing we're against. There is another question from Tiffany Jimenez, which I'm reading out, regarding it's I don't know if it's a question or a comment. There is a question here regarding the protection of natural resources. Instead of a nation-state framework, what if we adopt more of an indigenous worldview of the human relationship with the natural world, where our internal value system is interconnected with the natural environment? In other words, the more we value and understand our interdependence with the natural environment, the less we will enact extractivism as it relates to greed or in relationships with some forms of capitalism.
I mean, I agree with that entirely, but I think the question is more not just how, basically that's a solution of how we together reconceptualize how we see natural resources. But even outside of that nation state framework, I think it's kind of the suppression of that indigenous worldview by not only the nation state, but by transnational corporations is the question. Yeah, because I fully agree with that. An indigenous worldview and a different relationship to the natural world would be beneficial in terms of moving away from resource extraction. But given the system, kind of the imperialist system functioning in the way that it does, I'm very interested in what form of resistance can we take in the current moment that doesn't rely on basically, that's not, so what, how can we organize a resistance to resource extraction in, let's say, for example, in Mozambique, given the political context of imperialism today, where there's all the major oil companies basically settled there, and then there's major conflict in the north of Mozambique. And I think there's basically hurdles to overcome before we can get to the point of reconceptualizing or kind of creating that worldview. There's immediate kind of concerns, I think, about the exploitation of natural resources in those countries.
Yeah, I think that would probably require such an ideological, a critical mass of converted people, as it were, ideologically, to be able to take on the people with guns. Frankly.
Basically, I think also, I mean, I didn't maybe say it properly in the talk, is I think that's also something that during some of the, I think also in the revolution in Guinea-Bissau, that's something that happens, that's an educational process that was attempted to, or people were attempting to make that educational process happen during the revolution. But these are revolutions that are suppressed, so that educational process never really happened, as in trying to reconceptualize our relationship with the natural world, for instance. So it is something that relies very much on learning during a revolutionary process, and I think a lot of unlearning as well.
Okay, I will not comment because there is another question from, I should be able to maybe pronounce that, Petros Fokaidis. Oh, a great lecture. Thanks, Kevin. Do you know if Nireyere and Nukma, who followed completely different approaches in economic planning, had any exchanges?
I don't actually know if they had any direct exchanges. I know there's a lot of writing about both of their respective approaches and trying to basically relate them to each other. But also I think their different approaches also, it's very interesting as a comparative study as well, because both of them change quite a lot over time as well. And Nkrumah's economic approach, I think, changed quite significantly towards the end of his life, where he thought very differently about some of the processes of national liberation. But yeah, I think there is I don't know about any particular exchange that is directly between those two.
Okay, there's one more question from Angeliki. Thanks, Kevin, for this instructive talk. To what extent could the invention/creation of alternative institutions at all levels be part of the desired post-capitalist strategy, also towards greater control over resources? That is, would it be more a matter of control over existing resource management, or a matter of coming up with new institutional forms, laws, governance? Or what would be a good ratio in your case studies?
I think that's kind of that's the main question, I think.
I think so too.
yeah, as in, or that I was also trying, I don't have an answer for this, because I think that's what all those movements that I was talking about were also trying to basically come to grips with, is kind of whether you control kind of existing resource management, or like come up with some form or some institution that changes our relationship with this with resource management. Yeah, but I think sorry?
No, I'll say it afterwards, go on.
Yeah, but I think I mean it's the difficulty of coming up like with new institutional forms, given basically the repression of the establishment of those new institutional forms. So that, I think, is the difficulty that I always try to get at. It's, of course, it would be the best to establish these new institutional forms or laws or different forms of governance. but coming up against basically a violent repression, and specifically in the history of Eastern Africa as well, and I think the continent more broadly, it is a history of a violent history of repression of those kind of more popular democratic institutional forms that would address resource extraction in it, or like that would renegotiate our relationship to these natural resources. So I think that's oftentimes the difficulty that I try and get at, and also the historical moment, or trying to pull that to today as a question that I think remains unanswered.
Yeah, that's true. And I think there's two ways to attack such institutions. One is to suppress them from the outset, and the other is to let them fail, which in many ways is a more cunning way in which the system works, because it's much more convincing for people to want capitalism or whatever, let's say the status quo is, if you demonstrate the weakness, the propensity to failure of the alternative. I mean, because this way you get consensus and you don't even have to exercise violence. Although I think in the case of Africa, as you've been describing, there's no shortage of violence and direct suppression of anything else. So I think that we always need to think that, I have a feeling that this question also had to do with this very popular within certain parts of the left, and certainly the theories that we teach and so on, the idea of institutions of the common, which of course, it comes from autonomous and so on, which sounds, it's great, like, and sometimes, especially in the art world, we talk about them, but when it comes to overcoming the nation or changing the nation, and the brutality of imperialism when it comes to resources, there we test them. And with this, I thank you, because thank you very much for this absolutely essential talk. And we're going to move on to our next speaker, who I see is here.
And take a few minutes break.
And to Maria, take some break.
3 minutes. This time we go like less and less, 3 minutes. But thank you so much, Kevin. I was just like, we will take these questions further in the next days. I was thinking perhaps also of the notions of collectivizations that Jonas Stahl is also working on, and how this will play a role in this conversation and managing of resources. But yeah, for the next days. So now, 2-3 minutes, and then we are back with Pablo Tavares. Well, we are back. Thank you guys again for the previous speakers and Angela for these conversations. I'm super grateful to all of you. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Paulo Tavares. Paulo is an architect, researcher, and writer based in South America. His work deals with the relations between conflict and space and spans different territories, geographies, and media. He's currently, if I'm correct, a professor at the Facultad de Arquitectura e Urbanismo at the University of Brasilia in Brazil. In 2017, Paulo created the Agency Autónoma, a platform dedicated to urban research and intervention. He's a long-term collaborator of forensic architecture and was a fellow at the Canadian Centre for Architecture from 2018 to 19. He also co-curated the Chicago Architecture Biennial in 2019. In his talk today, Paulo will speculate on the potential concept of reparation architecture and how it opens up new visions for spatial practices outside the managerial, disciplinary, positivist frame that still haunts architecture. And I'm quoting him, and I'm really looking forward to hear this. Welcome, Paulo.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you all. It's great to be here. Thank you, Marina. Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Kevin. And thanks for the great lectures. So first of all, I want to thanks to this invitation. I'm very happy to participate in the seminar, which positions the questions of struggles and epistemologies in relation to solidarity. And, you know, by saying struggles and epistemologies, we are talking about questions of knowledge and power, right? And I guess that my practice, and it's interesting to me to articulate these ideas that political struggles, they have an effect on the way that we know the world, and the way that we know the world has an effect on certain political struggles. And I think that my practice is very much related to what I can call a kind of militant type of research, in which I am trying to mobilize architecture as a means of advocacy and as a means of political activism. At the same time, I'm trying to understand how certain types of knowledge and certain types of epistemic constructions that operate through architecture are means of power in themselves. So that means we need to sort of reframe, or if you will, decolonize certain types of assemblages of knowledge power that are operated through architecture. I guess I'm going to talk about this, maybe not so directly, but I'm going to talk about, you know, all the projects that I'm going to mention touch this relation between knowledge and power. But what I decided to do tonight is rather, you know, give a kind of live talk of something that's not sort of completely elaborated, which I'm calling reparation architecture. And I'm going to speculate on several projects that I developed in recent years and trying to frame this idea of what we can understand by a mode of architecture that redress spatial injustice, structural injustice, but that goes beyond a kind of managerial, biopolitical ways of dealing with the social. And so this is not sort of fully formed or fully thought. It was a dialogue that I'm having with several colleagues. And I want to get this opportunity to share with you some of open ideas so we can push them further, because I believe that the time of these ideas have arrived. And it's also important to say that when I'm talking about architecture or reparation architecture, the term architecture, I'm not only meaning the built environment, but rather a sort of expanded field of knowledge and power that operates across different mediums and forums and publics and audience. And that involves curating, involves design, it involves advocacy, it involves pedagogy, it involves militancy, and it involves indeed also the built environment. So I want to understand that you folks understand architecture in this kind of much more complex and multi-layer type of practice when I speak about it. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Let's hope it's okay. Can you guys see it?
Yes.
Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm going to run through some projects developed in recent years and trying to, very informally and nothing super prepared, sort of talk to you about them. The first one is called Deshabitat. And in this project, I want to speculate on how reparation architecture means reframing hegemonic and canonic narratives. This project was commissioned by an exhibition called Bauhaus Imaginista, created by Marion von Osten, that was set to somehow celebrate or mark the 100 years of Bauhaus last year. And so very much in dialogue with modernism or the legacies of modernism. And I did a project about a magazine that was published in Brazil called Habitat, that was designed and edited by Lina Bobardi, the sort of famous progressive architect in Brazil. And it's interesting to note that Lina somehow is at the vanguard of this type of definition of architecture that works with publication, media, curating, militancy, advocacy. And this magazine, Habitat, was a kind of militant sort of modernist magazine, right? Trying to teach to the urban elites. It was founded in the 40s, 50s, kind of mid-20th century. So trying to teach the urban elites or, communicate to the urban elites what was a modernist language, right? What was, in fact, a modernist habitat. So I was interested from very early on how Habitat brought several indigenous objects, indigenous arts and crafts as signifiers of modernity. So they would appear within the magazine, framed as, this idea of primitivism that defined modernity. But of course that in Brazil, this idea of the primitive was very much framed to the national, saying, this is our sort of primitive art, this is our sort of indigenous art. And that's the kind of inspiration somehow to a kind of new modern national language. And in Habitat, they would appear very much in relation to this modernist paintings and things like that in order to make this association between the primitive and the modern. And those objects, what interests me is that they appear somehow isolated, right? Suspended in between a kind of ethnographic and modern museum. And Habitat would use a sort of constructivist language and very much through the influence of Lina Bobardi, where she would associate certain types of images to communicate this idea of the primitive modern. And this is one of the covers of Habitat, designed by Lina Bobardi, with a jungle designed by her and a kind of brise soleil that's like this element of tropical modern architecture, and here the objects of Carajás. So this kind of constructivist imagetic association. So the question that we ask in this project is where those objects came from, right? How their image would appear as references of modernism and a modern language in a kind of urban magazine made for the elites. So we did a kind of excavation of Habitat and mapped throughout its history the several sort of articles and reportages on indigenous objects and crafts and rituals. There were many across its 16 years of existence. And we were trying to map where those objects came from, which kinds of collections, who collected them, to whom they belong, to which territory they belong, where these people were located. And we went back to the history that in Brazil, since early 20th century, the Brazilian state created something that was called the Service for the Protection of the Indian. And basically the mission of this state agency was to pacify indigenous groups that were at the frontier of national expansionism and settle them in what they call indigenous posts, in order to liberate their land for colonization and at the same time integrate them into the realm of the nation state. And this process of pacification, as it was officially called, was very much done through, introducing Western objects and somehow looting the objects that were parts of the cultural and rituals of those peoples. This is one image of the archive among the Kuikuro, bringing those Western goods to those quote unquote tribes that they were pacifying. And when Habitat was started to be published, there was over 100 of these indigenous posts spread throughout the Brazilian territory. So a really real sort of colonial network, but now deployed on behalf of national development and the nation state. And of course, that these indigenous posts, they open up not only the land of these people, but they also open the routes for photographers and ethnographers and image makers to make images of them, and somehow a process of extraction that was not only material, but also symbolic. And this institution, the Service for the Protection of the Indians, created a sort of research agency called the Section of Studies that were in charge of collecting and documenting those groups that were being pacified. And I like very much this image because it's a kind of museum-like display of objects that were extracted by this agency. And those are the same objects that would appear inside Habitat as reference of, you know, modernism and modern language. The difference is that Habitat excluded the colonial context in order to project them as autonomous objects of art and signifiers of modernity. So the project takes the form of sort of facsimile magazine of Habitat, in which we do several sort of graphic and textual interventions in order to complicate the framework that through which Habitat narrates such kinds of history, somehow appropriating, resignifying the very constructivist language of Habitat in order to show what was outside the framework, which is the colonial context from which those objects were looted and extracted. By exposing this out of frame, this Habitat therefore enables a reframing of certain mainstream narratives and discourses of modernization whose roots are grounded in colonialism. This reframe positions the questions of the plunder of land, objects, and images of indigenous communities to be placed in modern museums, and thereby presents a frame for their restitution, even if only operating through narrative and architectural media. So I think here there is an idea of an architectural, how we are working with this, you know, architecture as media in addressing questions of restitution, reparation by reframing hegemonic and canonic narratives, but not only on the level of critique, but also on the level of practice, and working not only with discourse, but also, let's say, with image, with visual discourse, and trying to really sort of shift the way in which those histories are told. And I guess, you know, of course, that you folks are in Europe, and the discussion of how to restitute objects that have been plundered and that have been celebrated as European culture became a kind of very central and important question for the cultural field. Another project that I want to share with you, it's called An Architectural Botany. And An Architectural Botany speaks a little bit about reparation architecture as questioning the archive and the museum as a colonial modern apparatus of knowledge power. So here I want to investigate another media, and this media is the archive. So this project is developed at the Center for the Canadian Center for Architecture, and it's an investigation on an archive of a botanist called William Ballet. And William Ballet researched the Amazon in the 80s together with Kapur communities. And he was responsible for a radical shift in the colonial Western imaginary about the forest and nature. Because he demonstrated that vast areas of Amazonia are in fact human-made. They're not natural forests. My internet is not super sharp.
Hi, Pablo. We are having some issues with the connection, I think.
Oh, okay. So let me try to take out a video. Because, yes, we're having some problems with connections. Oh. Let me try something. Sorry, guys. Can you hear me? I don't believe so.
Let's try now. Let's see if this is better. Let's try now. Let's see if this is better.
Mm-hmm. How's that now? Still a bit better?
Pablo, we are thinking
now?
we are thinking that maybe we can start again, like the connection. Start again, like the talking again to the
Right. Okay, let's try to the. Okay, let's try to do that.
everyone. Yeah, sorry for the connection problems. We have asked Paulo to connect again to go out offline and then connect again to the same link to see if the connection improves. So bear with us. Apologies for the inconvenience, and hopefully we will get a good connection back. Well, meanwhile, I take this opportunity to thank everyone involved, but also to remind that tomorrow we start with the screening of a video, the movie Geographies of Freedom by Miguel Pérez dos Santos in collaboration with Egbert Alejandro Martina. Miguel will be here with us, and the video, the movie won't be a live stream. It will be shared through our Zoom link. So just be tuned, because that part won't be streaming directly in YouTube. So you will need to get the code. Hi, Paulo, you're back.
Oh, so can you hear me?
Yes. Let's see. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, let's see. I'm so sorry. I'm going to take out my video. I hope you guys can hear me. It's yeah, unfortunately, we have been having some problems with the internet recently all around Brazil.
No worries, Paulo. We hear you well now. So take it again.
Yeah, let's try again. Can you see my screen?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Let me move to this. Okay, so okay, I'm sorry. Let's try to I guess I was speaking about okay.
Yes. Yeah, perfect. That was when you were starting to talk about the archive. We lost you. Yeah.
Okay. So let's go on the archive. I just need to open my presentation again because I needed to shut my computer to see if the internet works. So I want to address this question of preparation as the archive museum as an apparatus of knowledge power and how this is connected to architecture. So this project, it's developed at the Canadian Center for Architecture, and in a context of a project about the environment. And what I'm doing is revisiting an archive produced by a botanist called William Mallet. And William Mallet, in the 80s, he came to Brazil, and together with the Kapur, he did several field researches. And he was responsible for a kind of radical epistemic shift in the way we understand the forest, because he was able somehow, together with the Kapur, to prove, to show that that vast tracts of Amazonia were in fact human-made. That is to say, they are somehow designed to a certain extent. And this is the first phrase of this research by Ballet, and I want to read to you because it speaks about this relationship of the forest as a designed space in architecture. So the Kapur consultants, who I consider to be the most knowledgeable on the subject of forest types, told me our destination, the old growth forest, looked like a true forest, but that it was in reality an old village, long abandoned by any human occupier. They call it tapir. The tapir, that is the forest, gave living testimony to those early human lives. It's also that my images are super slow.
Paulo, I'm sorry to interrupt you again. The connection.
I'm sorry to interrupt you again. The connection
is not very good.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was thinking, what will happen if we try to talk over without the presentation? Would it that too bad?
Without the presentation, would it that too bad? Okay, yeah, let's try to do that. Let's do that, yeah, without the presentation. Let's see if we can. Let me stop sharing the camera. And I'm going to try to do it. Okay. It's really not working well. Oh, I'm so sorry. Just move. It's really not working. Sorry, my connection is not going. I really cannot make a move. It's really everything off. I'm so sorry. I don't even know if you can hear me.
We hear you, but very low. I was hearing you, but very low. I was.
Oh, that's a shame.
Paulo, I was thinking that would it make sense that because I hear my voice. If you can turn mute yourself one second. Yeah, I was thinking that I'm so sorry because you. I'm so sorry because you. Hi, Paulo, can you hear me? Yeah, at this point, I was thinking that it's rather uncomfortable for everyone to follow a live stream, yeah, a Zoom presentation that is not easily followed by all of you. So my apologies for that inconvenience. And also I'm sorry for Paulo because we were really looking forward for his presentation. I'm suggesting perhaps that if Paulo is still able to connect, maybe we can take a few questions online through the chat. And obviously that's not the ideal format, but maybe it's what I can come up now. And we will try to connect in another moment with him during these days, or perhaps ask him if he can record his presentation and share it even for tomorrow's or Saturday's session. Yeah, here I am.
Marina, first of all, our sincere apologies for this technological subversion that we had. It's not something we see often, so I think that actually we see very rarely. So I think that we were very unlucky with this. I don't know if Paulo is able to reconnect because...
Yeah, Paulo is here now again.
Okay.
Oh, guys, you know, all the public, everyone that's hearing, I'm so sorry. This is completely out of my control. I'm afraid I don't have the right conditions to do this lecture. I'm so sorry.
But Paulo, it's totally fine. We understand. I was thinking that maybe we can record your presentation and share with everyone in the next days. And maybe now, I don't know, we can have a conversation until the connection allow us. Yeah.
Okay, maybe I can speak a little bit.
Yes,
you know, it was really a sort of work in progress that I really want to share with you. So it's a shame. But anyway, I guess, you know, if you think about the ways in which the idea of social architecture, or, you know, socially, the way in which architecture was deployed through the social was very much, developed, let's say, during modernization, as Foucault would say, through very disciplinary and biopolitical means of power, and also at the same time in the way that questions of development and reform were deployed in the colony. So there is a way in which the subject of social architecture is very much always addressed to contain a certain type of potential revolutionary moment, right? So housing policies in 19th century, they were very much deployed to make the body of the working class docile. Certain reforms or so-called development reforms implemented in the colonies were also mean at curbing certain types of decolonial resistance, right? So this was the way also the United States imperialism very much operated in Latin America through the so-called development paradigm, and how certain philanthropic and humanitarian agents deployed some means of development as a way of managing somehow inequality and poverty in a certain way, right? So I'm trying to think about what would be forms of architecture in that way, in this sort of very expanded way, involve curating and image making and designing and publishing and things like that, and how we can think about new ways of conceiving forms of visual and spatial practice that, in addressing questions of structural injustice, are moved out of the sort of managerial, patronizing, humanitarian frame, and are really thinking about placing them as questions of structural justice. And for me, I think this implies, as I say, through this habitat, reframing certain types of canonic narratives. I think that's a kind of important gesture. I think the other one is to rethink the question of archive, and that means not only recovering central histories in the archive that are lost, but how the archive and museums operate a sort of epistemic device that defines certain types of knowledge that serve the imperialism. And I was mentioning the work with William Balem, because it is a way of understanding nature as something that's part of the constructed world. So somehow, rupturing with a kind of natural cultural divide, which is the sort of basis of a kind of imperial epistemology that define indigenous societies according to racialized categories of the primitive, then civilized, so on and so forth. So that's why I'm interested in reading, let's say, nature as a mode of architecture. Then there is another project that I mentioned. It's called Tree, Vines, Palms, and Other Architectural Monuments, where I interpret those forest landscapes as heritage. And I cannot explain this project now because I need images, but of course that reparation architecture involves questions of heritage, as we are seeing, right? So narratives through media. So the question of the archive museum as an epistemic frame, as a frame of power knowledge, questions of heritage, memory, memorialization, and history, which are accounted for and others are not accounted for. And also how they enter into the register of what counts and not counts as heritage, and what can be celebrated as memory or not. Another, I think, reparation architecture is also a means of advocacy. So if the cities are right, if the environment is right, if spaces and housings are right, design is a form of advocacy of such rights, right? So reparation involved advocacy in relation to those rights. And this is something that's also very important in my work, to think about, how can design can be deployed both as advocacy and as pedagogy. And to speak about the Chicago Architecture Biennial, which was called And Other Such Stories, one of the main texts that was important for us was Ta-Nehisi Coates, a text called The Case for Reparations, in which Ta-Nehisi is addressing the questions of reparation in relation to colonial racism and slavery in the United States. And in this text, he positions the question of housing and housing policies in the US in tandem with slavery and Jim Crow. Because we know the US, the housing policies in the US from the 30s, from the New Deal until the Fair Housing Act pushed forward by the Civil Rights Movement, they were in fact segregational policies, right? That used housing and public housing to create, to disenfranchise, to segregate, to isolate Afro-American communities. And Ta-Nehisi is going to pay a lot of attention in housing, and housing is interesting because it's the sort of basic unit of human dignity somehow, right? Not only housing, but also housing and land. That is for you to feed and that is for you to shelter. And he's going to say, well, this kind of economic infrastructural element is important for reparations, right? We need to close the wealth gap. And for this, we are going to need a series of positive measures that involve healthcare, that involve education, that involve indeed housing and other urban facilities in order for us to address the reparation. So beyond the symbolic, reparation also means infrastructure, right? It also means, the deployment of architecture as infrastructure. And there is an image that we use, and this was very important of the Chicago Architecture Biennial. In the Chicago Architecture Biennial, there were several practices, and I want to mention them. They were at the slides. I want to mention them that somehow were addressing this question of how to repair certain landscapes or how to repair central communities. Emmanuel Prats, the Sweetwater Foundation, Ilse Wolf from both architects, Vivian Sansour also participated with a very beautiful project on how seeds and land in the context of colonization of Palestine can also be used as a means of reparating memories and histories. And also Leopold Lambert, whose work with the Funambulist very much addressed questions of structural injustice and has just recently launched the volume on reparations, which was very inspirational and is very inspirational for me. And during the biennial, there was an image which I cannot show. My talk is very much based, so it's kind of, I feel a bit handicapped without image, but you can Google it, which is Martin Luther King. He, at the height of the civil rights movement, he goes to Chicago and he launched a campaign to end slums in Chicago. So, and this was a kind of huge campaign to, address the question of housing and segregation through housing.
We have lost your voice suddenly, Paulo.
Can you hear me?
Yes, maybe you were in mute. Yeah.
Okay, and during this this moment, he goes and performs this act of repairing his own house. There's a very beautiful image of Martin Luther King somehow performing this for a magazine as a kind of publicity stunt of the civil rights movement and repairing the house of the window of this house where he moved in. And that image was very important for me and for us because it meant something as repairing an architecture also meant repairing a broken nation, right? And I think in the moment that we are now, when we are seeing the explosion of social movements, we need to come into terms or forge a new meaning for architecture and design spatial practice at large that really can rethink and rewind the social in ways that escape the sort of modern colonial managerial, biopolitical, necropolitical framework through which they have been deployed in the history of modernity. I'm going to end here. I don't know if that makes sense to speak over like this, but yeah, thank
wonderful.
you. I'm sorry again.
Thank you so much, Paula. I think it was wonderful to have this explanation, and yeah, thank you for keeping with us, keeping with the travel, or staying with the travel. So I had perhaps, well, first of all, I think your practice is very inspiring and super relevant for many of us who are like catching up now with these questions. And I think your work has been pioneering in that, or it's not the best word actually, but in a way like leading in these conversations for a long time. So I'm going to make a very kind of provocative question, perhaps, that is, on the one hand, I think this idea of using architecture and the tools of architecture and even the tools of building knowledge around architecture, which are, as you mentioned, the magazine or the book, the archive, etc., and turn them against the very means of architecture to somehow
I'm not
colonize.
hearing, I'm sorry. Can you repeat, please? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was thinking that trying to be provocative, that this notion of using architecture against itself, right? This idea of architecture is obviously is inheriting violence, and then how to try to use it otherwise, these tools. And the notion of reparation, is it anti-revolutionary somehow, the notion of repairing? I mean, just for the sake of provocation, because I'm not saying that your practice is not revolutionary, but the question of repairing is assuming somehow that there is a previous stage that was somehow or pristine, or where everything was working, and that's where we have to go. So can you perhaps elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the questions. They are super interesting, and it's great to think with you about that. I think there is a way in which, we need to acknowledge the way in which architecture has been deployed and instrumentalized as an instrument. Hold on, sorry, can you hear me? Yeah, as an instrument of violence and as an instrument of colonization. And there is a way in which architecture is a type of practice which is built upon the ideology that it is inherently good. Even in the lexicon of deployed, sorry, someone calling me obsessively, how it's always deployed as a way of betterment, of improvement, of making the life of people better. And that's why people, when they, for example, they go to an architecture biennial, they want to see answers to problems of society. They also want to see how we're going to develop this, in such and that type of technology, because it's very positivist in the sense that it thinks it can engineering society and make it better, right? Instead of using architecture to pose questions, it's also demanded from architecture a certain type of solution. But if you look to architecture, in its history, one might see that it was most often deployed to do harm rather than to betterment, even when on behalf of certain, urban reforms and betterment, and, with this positivist sort of ideology and discourse, it was used to displace people, to segregate certain types of communities. And that is, the way in which architecture operates within a kind of imperial context. So in that sense, my practice, and I like very much this term, a kind of against architecture, and was something that, at the Chicago Architecture Biennial was also, one member of the public, when we were discussing, we said, well, is this a kind of biennial against architecture? In a sense, it is.
but it's also, using the means of architecture to question the ways in which architecture is an instrument of violence, and beyond that, how architecture is an instrument of certain constellations of knowledge power that operate very much as a means of subjugation and colonialism, right? And I guess, there are several sort of practices that are sort of subverting somehow the means by which architecture and design is done in order to do this kind of work. It's like, I tend to say it's like the city, right? The city, if you can think the city as a kind of police environment, but you can also think the city as a right. So I think we need to work with this dichotomy, because power is not something that, you hold, and resistance is also a practice. So we need to understand that we are always caught in this field. And about the question of reparation, is this, if it's anti-revolutionary, this is a great question. And I think, I'm going to open here something that would be great to discuss further, and I'm not sure about. But the idea of revolution, and very much how it was framed in the West, how we inherited somehow a kind of idea of revolution in the West, it's very much connected to the idea of progress, to the idea that, we are kind of evolving, or that is going to be a moment of rupture where we are going to achieve a certain state of utopia. And that state of utopia implies somehow a rupture with a certain past, right? That's why, in Marxist concept of revolution, you have certain types of stages in society that generates, the bourgeois came because of a process of primitive accumulation, and then you need the bourgeois revolution in order to have the socialist revolution. So there's a kind of evolutionary way, and revolution is connected very much somehow to living the past. And I'm very interest in trying to work a model of revolution and transformation that instead of using the framework of progress, uses the framework of ancestrality, of recuperating certain types of knowledge that are still much alive, but that the idea of progress and modernity told us that they were traditional, that they were not worth of value, that they were something of the past. Right. So I think that's one point of your question, so for me, the question of progress is very problematic in the kind of Western notion of revolution. And I think, very much of the sort of, we discuss a lot of third world in the first two talks. And I think, it was interesting to say how Kevin, he positioned the very idea of how the nation state, survived as a kind of internal imperial force within Africa, and it was very much also here in Latin America, because it adopted a certain type of revolutionary frame that, considered the nation state at its median, so to speak. So I'm interested, in think reparation is not something that's it's addressing a coming back to the past, but it's really thinking about a kind of futurity, but a futurity that implies that you rewind, you reconnect, you sue it again certain types of relationships that were neglected or that were framed as traditional, as past, in several processes of epistemicide, if we want to put it this way. So I think that's a very interesting question. I don't know if I answered to you, but
yes,
that's
absolutely. I think it's very fundamental what you're talking about, revolution and progress, and how generally we think, and architecture generally is seen precisely about as this tool of progress. So maybe there's some questions, but I wanted to ask you, in order to develop this practice, I guess there is in order to use this notion of architecture of reparation, I wonder how much importance has the fact that you, despite having associations or affiliations with forensic architecture in London or Canadian Center or Chicago, you have decided to go back and relocate in South America, and how that affects the practice you developed, and also your relation to the university, in the sense like how perhaps education and pedagogy are able to redefine or repurpose, in that sense, architecture from what has been taught it is to these other notions that you are putting now on the table?
Yeah, definitely, being South America and being here, in this territory, it's very important for my practice. And also my practice is very much connected to the territory. Let's say the kind of this geographic displacement and understanding other spaces that sometimes are not traditionally framed in architecture. In this kind of experience, is sort of crucial for me. And I think it's also crucial in the way that, specifically in Latin America, I would say, there's a sort of vitality of social movements. It's the troubled continent somehow, and how to connect it to, the framing of the seminar, how, the idea of struggles and resistance is very much connected to different types of knowledge, different ways of relating to the world, I would say, to land, that somehow are totally structured to the way I think, politics and activism today. And I tend to say that I never came back to South America, but I went again. No, instead of going back, it was like I'm going to South America again, because there is this idea of, it's always you are kind of knowing a new place where you are. It's, this experience, but definitely, seeing things from here, with all its precarity somehow, with internet connections and things like that. But it's very important for our work. It's also very important, I think, to be on the ground. I think to be on the ground is something that's also very crucial for this type of practice, because it's through practice that you somehow can sort of produce certain types of knowledge. And I think that's totally connected with, as you mentioned, pedagogy, in the way that, one can operate through different institutions in relation to pedagogy. I think the university, it's an interesting space, but more and more a very limited space somehow to address certain types of ideas that are urgent. And that's why I think we are now seeing a kind of, very interesting moment when collectives and teachers and artists and people from the cultural field, people from activists, they're demanding that their institutions should be reformed or transformed or repaired, right? Because those institutions that were also sort of, they also were means by which certain structures of power remain in place. That said, I think, to speak again about the South, there are several experiences in radical pedagogy in the South that I think are very inspiring, and, that it's worth recuperating. One of them is, of course, Paulo Freire. And we have been looking at this in different workshops that we did. This was one of the projects that I would show, how pedagogy needs to be contextual and contingent and really related to existential experience and existential struggles, and also aim towards a certain type of liberation, and how one can also, mobilize architecture as a form of pedagogy that would, empower people to produce, to navigate their spaces, to read and navigate their space in a different way. So I guess those are all of these is they are, epistemic positions that come from struggles, that come from process of resistance.
Maybe because we were discussing before with Angela and Kevin about institutions as well. And maybe Angela was pointing to the possibility of letting institutions fail. And what I see in your practice, I mean, again, this notion of reparation, and in a way you enact practices of occupation of form and space as well. When you go to the medium of the magazine, you occupy its medium, its form, the same with the archive. And now we are talking also what you were saying about universities that perhaps at some point is not enough as a space of education, of creation and circulation, sharing of knowledge. So again, not being trying to be polarizing or making dichotomies, but would you still think that the institutions that we have now, as for instance, the archive or the university, could be repaired, or should we let them fail? We should let them fail and grow new institutions, perhaps.
I guess a good institution is the one which is always failing and failing better, right? That's our practice, no, fail and fail better. So if an institution takes this as a mission, you know, that's always going to, I think that's interesting. But what I want to say, I want, you know, I think the institutions and the institutionality, the way they are, they need to be reformed, revolutionized, repaired, or failed in a certain way. I agree with this. And you know, it's not a question of, you know, just saying, well, you know, in the institutions we are now more open, we are more tolerant, you know, and we are sort of multicultural and diverse, and we have voices for everyone. I think this is not enough. I think there's a kind of structural aspect to this transformation, and I think this is not an easy task. I think it involves, as reparation, it involves society at large in profound discussions, which I think are happening. But at the same time, you know, coming from Brazil, and maybe that's also a question of perspective, you know, the institutions that we have, they're also very fragile in a certain way, right? Under the government that we are now, the first attack of this government was in the cultural field. He is actively trying to dismantle cultural institutions in Brazil because he is waging a cultural war, right? And this cultural war affects, first and foremost, artists, cultural producers, and because of his sort of patriarchal, white supremacist ideology, you know, it affects non-normative bodies, trans people, non-binary gender people, brown and black people, because those communities were really much empowered by the cultural field in Brazil in the last years. So, you know, at the same time that I think, you know, our institutions, and I'm speaking also of my university, which I'm fighting against constantly, you know, to reform some of its aspects. It's also, I think we need to care, you know, at least I hear in here in our situation, we need to care for certain types of structures that we have built and take them as our own,
Thank you. They are telling me to wrap up, but I want to read at least one more question from Mena Aga, and it says...
There's at least two comments and questions.
Ola as well. Thank you very much for this great lecture. Despite the technical issues, I agree, architecture as a body has been implicated in reparation schemes in many cases. I wonder if you have comments on activating notions of pluriversality, and how do you think an architecture studio could be equipped to tackle such an issue?
Right. I think that's a big question. And I think, who made the question, Ola?
No, Mena Aga.
Yeah.
Oh, Mena, how are you? Thank you for the question. You know, because me and Mena, we have been somehow exchanging Facebook sometimes, also discussing this question. And I think it's a question for us to pose, really, when we're trying to think about this idea of, you know, how reparation affects architecture. I think it's a question that, you know, we should discuss and think how this can enter into a studio and how those questions can be, you know, framed and brought within, and not only the studio, but of course the syllabus, of course the, you know, the structures in which the studio is taught, the very sort of hierarchical principle of an architecture studio. I think those questions are really at the table right now, and I think there's lots of discussions around that. So definitely, I think the studio is a place for this to be addressed. How it should be done, you know, I think it's something that we should do together in practice, and I'm looking forward to, you know, to continue this conversation.
And finally, we have a question from our dear Ola Hassanain. So she says, the idea of revolution considers also that power and its violence comes from the outside. And your practice seems to say that through architecture, it seems to make us think of power being more inside and in these walls. Maybe you can, and also it's always nice to listen to your talks, Paulo.
Thank you, Ola. Thank you for the question. Thank you for being here. I guess this is a question that, you know, you would be perhaps even better equipped to respond. Yeah, I think, you know, for me, let's say I'm going to reply with a Foucauldian sort of notion, you know, when power is not something that you hold, it's not a possession, it's not a property, it's something that is exercised. And it finds many different ways to be exercised. It finds ways, I think, that are imposed from the outside, you know, but also it's very capillary, it's very, you know, it's very granular, it's kind of traverses our body. And sometimes we are even sort of conduits to power, and we reproduce power relations, you know, in everyday aspects. So, you know, in architecture, what the power of architecture is that although it operates as this apparatus, this mechanism of power, it's always disguised as something, you know, that is going to work for the betterment, that's going to work for progress, that's work to, you know, to do a kind of lesser evil, if you want. You know, it's always on an idea of betterment. And I think that's the kind of ideological power of architecture. And this ideological power is always manifested in the way that architects think that, you know, we need to, that architecture express the less technology. It's the formal sort of expression of the less technology, and that we are going to solve things in society by applying, you know, the less developments of rationalism and Western technology to architecture. And this is going to sort out, for example, societal problems. We saw this with coronavirus, for example. You know, all the major sort of architectural labs, they were researching things that would, in fact, let's say, intensify the digital environment of controlling bodies that we live now on, the kind of digital state control, right? So, you know, this was the kind of vanguard of us replying to the coronavirus. How can we have more data? How can we track people's movements? How, you know, we can identify sources of disease and things like that. So let's deploy technology, digital technology, because that's the last sort of a development, advancement. But in fact, it's just increasing the level of state security and corporate sort of violation of our privacy. Whereas I think, for example, that the coronavirus should be solved by the question of rights, universalizing the question of housing, for example, right? So if you see architecture through rights and not as a positive sort of, you know, response to certain situations, but you see as a question of reparation, because universal housing is also a question of reparation, I think we are able to frame problems, social problems, problems of injustice in a new light, and really free architecture from, you know, its kind of ideology of what I'm calling like positivism, development, civilization, progress that haunts the discipline.
Thank you so much, Paulo. We are really grateful and happy that this worked out. And it's always a pleasure to listen to you. So thanks again for being here. And yeah, thank you everyone who has been listening. Tomorrow we continue at 5 Central European time, not South. And we will have the screening of Geographies of Freedom by Miguel Pérez dos Santos and lectures by Yaisa Hernández Velázquez, Marco Barbale, and Athena Athanasiou. I'm very, very thankful to things, Kevin, Paulo, and obviously Angela, my partner in crime, and always brilliant. And as Jonas was saying, we have transformed through Angela the new institute in a broadcasting propaganda machine. So
I think that's my role, yeah, overall.
That's your role, Angela. So thank you for that. So thank you, everyone. We are being kicked out from here. So Angela, perhaps you want to say also something?
I do. I have questions I didn't ask. I hope somehow to bring them, to carry them over tomorrow. I want to really thank the people who are with us, the participants, for the questions, comments, and for listening. We have great participation, and this is absolutely fantastic. Our speakers, Marina, the wonderful team that you have with you as the New Institute, and we'll see you tomorrow. We'll see you tomorrow.
We continue. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. I'm sorry again. Thank you.
Bye.
Stupid. This is really stupid.